The courtroom went dead silent when the judge read the verdict aloud. Life in prison, no possibility of parole, for a decorated police officer who had pressed a loaded gun against the chest of a woman he believed had no power, no voice, and no one watching. He was wrong on every count. The woman he cornered at a military memorial, the one in plain scrubs with quiet eyes and no rank on her collar, had commanded battalions in 3 combat zones, earned citations that most officers would never see in 2 lifetimes, and buried soldiers she loved like family. Derek Callahan picked the wrong woman, and the entire country watched him find out why. If this story has you gripping your seat already, you are exactly where I need you to be. Follow this channel so you don't miss a single moment of what's coming. Hit like if you believe people like Mara deserve to be seen, and drop a comment right now telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The morning Mara Voss arrived at Callaway Regional Medical Center, the sky over Dunmore, Pennsylvania was the color of old pewter, flat, heavy, the kind of overcast that presses down on a city like a thumb. She'd driven 40 minutes from her apartment on the east side, the same route she'd taken for 3 years, past the shuttered textile mill, and the diner with the broken neon sign, and the underpass where teenagers had spray-painted something that might have once been a mural, but now just looked like anger. She knew this drive the way she knew a patient's vitals, automatically, without having to think about it, which meant her mind was somewhere else entirely. It was on Corporal Devin Okafor. Devin had been 26 years old. He'd served 2 tours in the 82nd Airborne, come home with a Purple Heart and a titanium rod in his left femur, and taken a job at the VA outreach office in Dunmore because he said he wanted to help the ones who were still trying to find their footing. He'd been found unresponsive in his apartment 11 days ago. The official report called it a cardiac event. Mara had read the report twice, and both times her stomach had done the same thing. A slow, cold drop. The way it used to before a mission briefing when something about the intelligence didn't add up. Devin Okafor had been 26 years old, with no documented heart condition, no family history, and a medical file so clean it practically squeaked. She'd known him for 8 months. She'd met him through the veterans support group she volunteered with on Thursday evenings at St. Crispin's Community Hall. He'd been quiet at first, the way a lot of them were quiet. Not broken, just careful. He'd started talking after the 4th session. By the 8th, he'd pulled her aside after the group dispersed and told her he'd found something at the VA office. Something that bothered him. He'd never gotten to tell her what it was. Mara pulled into the hospital parking structure at 6:47 a.m., killed the engine, and sat for a moment in the dark of the concrete garage. She was 49 years old. She had gray threaded through hair she kept short and functional. A face that people sometimes described as stern before they got to know her, and then amended to something like steady. She wore no jewelry except a plain watch with a cracked crystal she'd never gotten around to replacing. Her hands, folded now in her lap, were a trauma nurse's hands. Strong, deliberate, with the kind of fine motor precision that came from 10,000 hours of practice in conditions that would have made most people freeze. Before they were a trauma nurse's hands, they had been other things. She did not think about that this morning. She got out of the car, pulled her bag over one shoulder, and went to work. The trauma bay at Callaway Regional was not a forgiving environment. It ran on controlled pressure, the kind of sustained, organized urgency that the untrained eye sometimes mistook for chaos. Mara had been charge nurse on Trauma 2 for 3 years, and in that time she had learned the specific rhythms of every person on her team. The way a conductor learns an orchestra, who ran fast under pressure and who went still, who needed a directive and who needed space, who talked too much when they were scared. She liked her team. That was not nothing. Voss, Petrin Gwen, her second in command, met her at the bay entrance with a tablet and a look that meant the shift had started without them. GSW coming in from Route 9, ETA 4 minutes. Also, Harmon wants to see you before rounds. After the GSW, he said before. He can keep saying it. Mara took the tablet, scanned the incoming patient's preliminary stats. Male, mid-30s, single gunshot wound to the right shoulder, BP dropping. Get a type and cross ready. Alert or 2 that we may be coming up. Already done. Good. She handed the tablet back. Who's in the bay? Delgado and Ewan. Kowalski's finishing a handoff. Fine. Let's go. The GSW came in hard. The paramedics were still talking when the gurney cleared the bay doors. overlapping each other with vitals and scene information, while the patient, a man named Terrence, gripped the side rail and stared at the ceiling with the specific wide-eyed focus of someone using sheer willpower to stay conscious. Mara was already at the bed, gloves on, assessing the wound while Delgado called out BP and Ewan started a second IV line. "Terrence!" She kept her voice level, direct, not loud. "I'm Mara. I'm your nurse. You're at Callaway Regional. We've got you." He looked at her. Something in his face shifted. Not relaxed exactly, but redirected. "The bullet," he started. "I see it. Exit wounds clean. You're going to be okay, but I need you to let us work. Can you do that?" He nodded. His grip on the rail loosened, just slightly. That was the job. Not the technical skill, though that mattered, but the moment when a frightened human being decided to trust you with their body. Mara had never taken that lightly, not in this hospital and not in the other places, the ones she did not think about on ordinary mornings. 48 minutes later, Terrence was in OR2, and Mara was washing up at the sink bay when she allowed herself to think about Harmon. Dr. Elliot Harmon was the chief of emergency services, and a man who had been hired 18 months ago from a private hospital group in Atlanta under circumstances that the staff had never fully gotten a clear explanation for. He was 44, well-dressed in the specific way of people who want you to notice they're well-dressed, and he had the administrative habit of calling meetings that were really just monologues with an audience. Mara had no strong feelings about him personally. Professionally, she had several. He was waiting in his office, which smelled of fresh coffee he hadn't offered her, and a faint chemical newness from the carpet that had been replaced 2 months ago after he'd complained about the old one. "Close the door," he said. She did. "Mara." He put his elbows on the desk and made a steeple of his fingers, which she found immediately irritating. "I'll get to it. I've been reviewing the trauma unit's resource allocation, and I want to restructure the charge nurse rotation." She waited. "Specifically, I'm thinking of moving you to the overnight float position, covering different units as needed." "That's a demotion." He didn't flinch. "It's a reassignment. The unit needs—" "I'm the most senior trauma nurse in this hospital." She said it flat, no heat. "I've run that bay for 3 years. Our response times are in the top 7% for the region. So tell me what this is actually about." His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A slight recalibration, the look of a man who had expected this to go differently. "It's about the unit's direction going forward. I think fresh leadership. You want me off trauma too." "I want the best configuration for Dr. Harmon." She leaned forward just slightly. "I've been in situations where people talked around a thing rather than saying it, and it has never once made the thing go away. So I'm going to ask you directly, is this about the Okafor inquiry?" The silence lasted 2 seconds. That was enough. "I don't know what you're referring to," he said. "Devin Okafor, 26-year-old veteran, died 11 days ago. I submitted a request to the hospital's Veteran Liaison Office last week asking about the case. Standard follow-up. I'm a volunteer with the veteran support group he attended." "That has nothing to do with—" "Good." She stood. "Then there's no conflict with me staying in my current position. I'll let you know if the overnight float schedule needs any input from Trauma 2. She picked up her bag. "Mara." His voice had gone quiet in a way that wasn't soft. "The memorial for the Okafor boy is this weekend, at Fort Keswick. I understand you were planning to attend." She turned back. "I'd encourage you to think carefully about whether that's the right use of your time." She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze, which took something. "I'll see you at rounds," she said, and walked out. Well, Fort Keswick sat 12 miles south of Dunmore, on land the Army had occupied since the Second World War. The memorial was scheduled for Saturday afternoon, a formal service for Corporal Devin Okafor, attended by his unit, his family, and the veterans community that had come to know him in the 18 months since his discharge. Mara had been to more military memorials than she could count, in places with worse weather and harder chairs and grief that had no language for itself. She went because she believed in showing up. It was not a complicated reason. She arrived at the fort's outer checkpoint at 1:15 p.m. in civilian clothes. Dark slacks, a gray coat, no uniform, because the uniform she'd once worn was packed away in a box in her closet, and she had not touched it in years. She gave her name to the gate officer, a young private who looked at his list, and then looked at her with the particular blankness of someone who hadn't found what they were looking for. You're not on the approved civilian list, ma'am. I may be under a different department. I'm associated with the St. Crispin's Veterans Support Group. We were told civilian guests could attend. I'll need to call it in. He reached for his radio. Of course. She waited. Cars moved through the adjacent lane. The sky had cleared since morning and the air was cold and still, the kind of stillness that carries sound a long way. From somewhere inside the fort, she could hear the distant, measured cadence of a military band warming up. The private finished his call and came back with a look she recognized. Not hostility, exactly, but the careful neutrality of someone passing along bad news they hadn't authored. Ma'am, the officer in charge of the event says your name wasn't submitted through the proper channels. I can't let you through. Who's the officer in charge? Lieutenant Garrett Voss, ma'am. Can I speak with him? Another pause. Another call. Then, he says, if you want to submit a formal request for future events, it's today's event. She kept her voice mild. Corporal Okafor's memorial is this afternoon. I knew him personally. I'm here to pay my respects. The private looked genuinely uncomfortable. I understand, ma'am, but without authorization, can I speak with someone from his unit, just to confirm my connection to the group? She was still working through it, patient, methodical, the way she approached a blocked airway or a tangled IV line, when the second vehicle pulled up. A white SUV, civilian plates, and the man who got out of it was in a police officer's uniform, Dunmore PD, with the chest-forward posture of someone accustomed to having their presence resolve situations before they spoke. Officer Marcus Holt was not Derek Callahan. He was something in the same genus, the specific type of authority that had calcified early and never been seriously tested. He looked at the checkpoint, looked at Mara, and made a fast and uncomplicated assessment. Problem here? No problem, Mara said. Just a gate issue. She's not on the approved list, the private said. She's trying to get through without authorization. Holt moved closer. Not aggressive yet, but angled. You got ID? I have civilian ID. She reached into her coat and produced her driver's license. I'm a trauma nurse at Callaway Regional and a volunteer with a veterans support group. I was here to attend the memorial for Corporal Okafor. Holt looked at the license and back at her with the expression of someone who had decided something before the conversation started. This is a restricted military event. Civilians go through proper channels. I understand that. I'm trying to reach someone who can verify. Ma'am, I need you to step back from the checkpoint. The word ma'am had a weight to it. Not respectful. Something else. I'm not blocking anything, she said. You're causing a delay at a federal installation checkpoint. That's a problem. He moved again. Shoulder angle, weight shift, the preparatory geometry of a man deciding whether a situation was about to become physical. This is where it would have ended in any sensible world, where someone with a radio or a rank verified her connection to the group, acknowledged the administrative gap, and led a 50-year-old nurse through a gate to attend a young soldier's memorial. That was the version of this story that should have existed. Instead, she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Derek Callahan. She knew him by reputation before she knew him by face. Derek Callahan had been with Dunmore PD for 14 years. He'd been the subject of 9 internal complaints in that time. Excessive force, civil rights violations, conduct unbecoming, and he'd survived all of them. She knew this because Devin Okafor had mentioned his name in the last conversation they'd had, the one where Devin had said, quietly, and with the careful tone of someone choosing their words around something that scared them, that there were people connected to the VA office who he thought might find out he'd been looking into things he wasn't supposed to look into. Callahan was broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been handsome once and gone rough with years of something. Not age exactly, but the particular erosion of a man who had operated without consequences long enough that he no longer thought about them. He assessed her the way Holt had, faster and with less neutrality. There was something almost interested in his expression. What's the situation? Civilian trying to access the memorial without authorization, Holt said. She won't step back. I haven't refused anything, Mara said. I've asked to speak with someone who can confirm my connection to the group. Callahan looked at her. You a friend of the family? I knew Corporal Okafor through his veterans support group. Right. He said the word like a period. And you didn't think to get on the guest list? I was told civilian guests from affiliated organizations. Who told you that? She paused. A member of the group. So you have no documentation, no authorization, no formal connection to the event. He stepped closer, not dramatically, just incrementally, the way you move to narrow space without being asked to. Ma'am, this is a military installation. You're standing here telling me an informal conversation with someone is enough to get you past a federal checkpoint. I'm asking to speak to someone inside who can verify my presence is appropriate. And I'm telling you that's not how this works. His voice had gone pleasant, which was worse than if it had gone hard. You need to move back from this checkpoint. You do it now, or we have a very different kind of conversation. Mara looked at him. She looked at the hand near his belt. She had been in negotiations across a table from people with considerably more power and considerably more weapons than Derek Callahan, and she had learned that there were exactly two responses to that specific combination of pleasantness and proximity: capitulate or change the terms. My name is Mara Voss, she said. I want that on record. I'm not resisting anything. I'm asking to speak with the officer in charge of this event before I move anywhere. Your name's on record, Callahan said. Move. Lieutenant Voss is not coming out here for you. He stepped forward. The hand came off his belt. This is your last... Officer Callahan. The voice came from the far side of the checkpoint, clear, male, and with the specific resonance of someone accustomed to being heard across distance. Both men turned. The man who walked toward them was in army dress uniform, the kind that accumulated its own gravity. He was perhaps 60, with a face weathered by decades of outdoor service, and the insignia on his collar was the kind that junior officers noticed before anything else about a person. Colonel Randall Eames. Mara knew him. She had known him for 22 years. He stopped 3 feet away, looked at Callahan, and looked at Mara with an expression that held no surprise at all. Is there a difficulty here? He asked. This civilian, Callahan started. I wasn't asking you. He looked at Mara. Mara. Randall. She kept her voice level. Gate issue. I was trying to get it resolved. Of course. He turned to the private at the checkpoint. Clear her through. Sir, she's not on the... I'm authorizing her access. Is that clear enough? The private stepped aside. Mara moved through. Callahan stood with his weight forward, jaw set, watching the exchange with the expression of a man recalibrating. You know this woman? He asked Eames. Better than most, Eames said, and walked with Mara away from the checkpoint without turning back. They were 30 yards inside before he spoke again. You look like you've had a morning. And a half, she exhaled. Devin. I know. His voice changed, not softer, but lower. That's partly why I'm here. There are questions about the report. She stopped walking. What kind of questions? He glanced around them. Not paranoid, just habitual. The kind that don't get asked officially. Come on, we'll talk after the service. The memorial was held in the fort's formal courtyard, folding chairs on flagstone, the cold afternoon air carrying the smell of turned earth from the cemetery, 200 yards east. Okafor's family sat in the front rows, his mother, a small woman in a black coat who held herself with tremendous stillness, and his younger sister, who cried without trying to stop. His unit members stood in the back in dress uniform, and Mara stood among the civilian guests, watching the ceremony with the particular attention of someone who has seen too many of them to stop seeing them clearly. She noticed 3 things. The first, 2 men in civilian clothes, not military bearing, standing at the periphery of the gathering. Not family, not media. Watching, in the specific way that people watch when they're being paid to. The second, a folder tucked under the arm of a young sergeant she recognized from the support group. A woman named Britta Callum, who had mentioned knowing Devin from his VA work. Britta had the tight-shouldered look of someone carrying something they were waiting to put down. The third, Derek Callahan, standing near the outer gate, still inside the fort's perimeter, watching the ceremony from a distance with no expression at all. After the service, as the crowd dispersed in clusters, Mara found Britta at the edge of the courtyard. You have something, she said. Not a question. Britta looked at her. You're from the support group. You knew Devin. Well, he talked about you. She lowered her voice. Said you were someone who understood how things actually worked. She shifted the folder. He gave this to me 3 weeks before he died. Said if anything happened to him, I should find someone trustworthy. What is it? Documents from the VA office. records he'd pulled. He said they showed a pattern of veteran deaths being reclassified: cardiac events, accidents, suicides. Veterans who'd been flagged in a specific database before they died. She pressed the folder toward Mara. All young, all healthy, all connected to a specific oversight program. Mara took the folder, held it, felt the weight of paper that had traveled a bad distance to get to her hands. Does anyone else know you have this? Britta's face answered the question before she did. I think so. Yeah. I think someone might have been following me for the past week. Mara looked up. The two men at the periphery had moved. Not dramatically, just enough to be somewhere they hadn't been. And then she heard it. A raised voice at the gate, and then another voice, sharper, and then the unmistakable silence that falls over a crowd when something turns wrong. She moved toward it before she'd decided to. Randall Eames was at the gate, speaking in the low, controlled tone of a man restraining something larger. Callahan was across from him, and in his hand, raised at chest level, not pointed yet but not holstered, was his service weapon. I need everyone to step back from this gate, Callahan was saying. There are questions about unauthorized access to a federal installation, and I'm detaining— Lower your weapon, Eames said without raising his voice. Sir, I'm a law enforcement officer investigating— I'm aware of what you are. Lower your weapon. People had gone still. A woman pulled a child backward. Two soldiers near the ceremony entrance were already moving, not running, but the kind of controlled fast walk that has running in it. Callahan's eyes found Mara across the courtyard. She didn't flinch. She held the folder at her side and she looked at him. And she saw the exact moment he decided she was the problem. Not Eames, not the soldiers, but her, this woman he'd turned away at a gate, who had still somehow gotten inside, who was now standing 30 feet away holding something under her arm. You. He pointed the weapon toward her, not aiming, not precisely, but directed, a gesture that was also a threat. You need to come with me right now. The silence that followed was the specific kind that exists in the second before something breaks. And then, from behind her, a voice she hadn't heard in 6 years said her name. Not Voss, not ma'am, not nurse. The title she had last used in a theater of operations in Eastern Europe, spoken in a tone that did not request anything. General Whitmore. Callahan's arm dropped 3 inches, involuntarily. Because 3 people in his immediate vicinity had gone rigid, not from fear, but from the specific physical response of trained military personnel to a word that rearranges a room. And the name was wrong. He'd said Whitmore, not Voss. And Mara had not corrected him. She had not corrected him because she hadn't needed to, and because a part of her that she kept very carefully stored in a box in a mental closet alongside an actual box in a physical closet had just kicked the door open. She took 3 steps toward Callahan. Even, measured, no aggression in the movement, just direction. Officer Callahan, she said. Her voice was something she hadn't used in a long time. Not loud, not harsh. Something underneath loud. You are pointing a weapon at a federal installation during a military memorial service. You are going to lower it, and then you and I are going to have a very different conversation than the one you thought you were having today. He stared at her. Behind him, the 2 soldiers reached the gate. The folder in her hand had documents that could unravel something she didn't yet have the full shape of. Devin Okafor's name was written on the top sheet in handwriting she recognized. And somewhere behind her, the man who had just called her by a name she hadn't publicly answered to in half a decade was watching with the expression of someone who had known this was coming and had driven 12 miles to be here when it arrived. Callahan's weapon was still up. His face had gone wrong. Not angry now, but the other thing. The thing that comes when a man who has never genuinely miscalculated starts to suspect that he just has. Who are you? He said. She looked at him and did not answer and did not look away. She looked at him and did not answer and did not look away. The question hung in the cold air between them. Who are you? And Mara let it hang. She had learned in rooms and situations considerably more dangerous than this one that silence had its own kind of pressure. That sometimes the most effective thing you could do was simply not give a man the release valve of a response. Callahan's weapon was still up, not fully aimed but elevated, which in a legal sense amounted to nearly the same thing. His eyes had gone to the man behind Mara, the voice that had spoken the name that had visibly recalibrated the 2 soldiers at the gate. and then back to her. And in that movement, Mara could see him trying to restructure something, trying to fit what he thought he knew into a shape that still worked for him. It wasn't fitting. Lower the weapon. This came from one of the soldiers at the gate, a staff sergeant named, as Mara would learn later, Dwayne Pryor. He said it without elevation, the way you say something you only intend to say once. Sir, I am asking you to lower the weapon on a federal installation. Callahan's jaw worked. He was a man who had spent 14 years making other people blink first. His record proved it. 9 complaints, 0 consequences, a career built on the assumption that the institutional machinery around him would keep grinding in his favor. He was trying to apply that assumption now and finding the gears weren't catching. He lowered the weapon. Not gracefully. The way a man lowers something when he's decided to set it down rather than having it taken from him, because the distinction still matters to him. This isn't over, he said to the air between them. No, Mara agreed. It isn't. She turned her back on him and walked back toward the courtyard. The folder was still under her arm. Her hands were steady. Her heart rate was elevated but controlled. She could feel it, that old familiar machinery running underneath the surface, the thing that switched on when situations moved past the point of ordinary management. She didn't miss it. She wasn't glad it was still there. Both of those things were true at once. Randall Eames fell into step beside her. 6 years, he said. 5.5. You didn't flinch. I never flinch, she glanced at him. Who said the name? Carver. He's here for the same reason I am. Eames kept his voice low and his pace even, like two people having a conversation about nothing in particular, which was a habit both of them had developed in contexts neither of them discussed. When I heard Okafor had died, I made some calls. Carver made some calls. There's something wrong with the report, Mara. Wrong in a way that didn't happen by accident. She thought about the folder under her arm. The documents Britta had pressed into her hands, the ones Devon had kept and planned to give to someone trustworthy. How wrong? Eames was quiet for 3 steps. The toxicology report that went into the official file isn't the original. The numbers were adjusted. Specifically, a compound that shouldn't have been present was removed from the record. She stopped walking. Keep moving, he said, and she did. What compound? Potassium chloride in concentration. The kind of concentration that stops a heart and disperses fast enough that if you know what you're doing, it's gone from the tissue by the time a standard autopsy runs. He kept his eyes forward. Someone knew what they were doing. The cold air felt colder. This was in the original toxicology? The original that was run at the county lab, yes. It never made it into the official report. What made it into the official report was a clean result with a note about hypertrophic cardiomyopathy that wasn't in his service medical file. Who had access to the report between the county lab and the VA's official file? That is exactly the question. He paused. And there are 3 names on the chain of custody, one of which belongs to a person who has been dead for 4 months. Mara processed this. She had the particular stillness of someone whose mind was running very fast while the rest of them stood very still, a quality her former staff had called unnerving until they learned to read it as productive. Who's Carver? She asked. DI, Defense Intelligence Agency. I was running a separate inquiry into unusual veteran deaths in the Mid-Atlantic corridor. Okafor wasn't the first name on his list. Eames glanced toward the far end of the courtyard, where a man in civilian clothes, compact, watchful, early 50s, stood with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at nothing in particular with very careful eyes. He doesn't know about the folder yet. He's going to need to. I know, but not here. He stopped walking again, this time for real. Callahan didn't come to this memorial because he heard about a gate incident. He drove out here for a reason, and the 2 men you noticed at the edge of the crowd are not family members. She'd known he'd noticed them too. Surveillance? Private contractor. I've seen that kind of setup before. Not military, not federal, something hired and informal that has enough overlap with both to move in these spaces. His voice was very careful now, threading something complicated. Whatever Okafor found in those files, Mara, someone knew he'd found it, and I think they know that whatever he had, it didn't die with him. She looked down at the folder. They followed Britta, she said. Probably for a week, maybe longer. He met her eyes. Which means they know she handed something to you approximately 11 minutes ago. and they know your car is in the outer lot. He let that sit. Carver has a vehicle on the south side, unmarked. You should be in it before Callahan finishes his conversation with the gate officer. This was the moment, the specific fulcrum point where a person chose the kind of morning, and then the kind of day, and then the kind of thing that followed from the day, that they were going to have. Mara recognized it with the clarity of someone who had stood at several such moments and made the same kind of choice each time, and was standing here now with a folder of documents and a dead young man's handwriting on the top page, and there was really no question at all what she was going to do. "Tell Carver I'll be there in 3 minutes," she said. She turned and went to find Britta. Britta Callum was at the edge of the parking area closest to the courtyard, car keys in hand, the kind of body language that communicated she'd been thinking about leaving since the moment she'd handed over the folder. When she saw Mara coming, she looked briefly relieved and then more worried, which was about the right order of reactions. "You need to leave now," Mara said. "Not in 10 minutes. Now." Britta's face sharpened. "What happened at the gate?" "Nothing you need to be inside for. Do you have somewhere to be that isn't your apartment?" "My sister's in Harrisburg. Go there. Don't go home first. Do you have your phone?" "Yes." "Turn off location services before you get on the highway. Not airplane mode, just location services, because airplane mode looks deliberate, and location off just looks like a dead battery." This was the kind of operational specificity that came from places Mara didn't explain. "Call your sister from the car. Don't mention where you're coming from or why." Britta stared at her. "You're scaring me." "Good." She said it without apology. Being scared and being safe can happen at the same time. "Go." Britta went. Mara watched the car pull out and then turned for the south lot. Carver's vehicle was a gray domestic sedan with nothing remarkable about it, except that the windows were slightly too dark for a civilian vehicle, and the man behind the wheel was watching the rearview mirror with more attention than traffic warranted. He reached over and opened the passenger door as she approached. She got in. The folder went on her lap. "Mara Voss," he said. Not a question. "That's right. Used to be something else." Also not a question. "Used to be a lot of things." She looked at him. "Carver?" "James Carver, DIA, retired 14 months, currently a pain in several agencies' necks on a civilian basis." He pulled out of the lot at a speed that was exactly the speed of a person with nowhere urgent to be, which took discipline. "Colonel Eames says you have documents." She opened the folder on her lap. The top page was a VA database printout, a list of names, identification numbers, service records. Beside each name was a code designation that she didn't immediately recognize, and a date. The dates ranged across 14 months. "Do you recognize this code?" She turned the page toward him. He looked for 2 seconds. His face did not change. "Where did Okafor get this?" "He worked at the VA outreach office. How do you know the code?" "Because it matches a designation I found in a parallel document from a federal contractor called Ariston Group." He said the name the way you say a name that you've spent a long time getting to. "Ariston has a contract with the Veterans Benefits Administration for database management and casework optimization. What that means, in practice, is that they have access to the records of every veteran in their assigned regions: health history, financial status, claims activity, prior service records including classified elements. And the code flags veterans who meet a specific profile. We think the profile is related to potential whistleblower risk. Veterans who've accessed sensitive records, made complaints, or been in contact with oversight bodies." He stopped at a light. "The ones with codes next to their names on your list. How many?" She counted. 17. "On mine there were 12. Okafor's name wasn't on mine yet. He must have been flagged more recently." His voice was precisely controlled. "How many of the 17 have death dates next to their names?" She went through the list. Her stomach did the slow, cold drop again. 9. He nodded, just once. "We think it's 11, on our end, which means the 2 lists together. Overlap." She was already looking. 5 names appeared on both, with matching code designations and matching dates. "This is a pattern." "This is a program," he said. "That's the difference. A pattern can be coincidence. This is designed." He turned onto the highway entrance. Okafor was the only one who managed to pull documented evidence from inside the database before someone noticed he was looking. He was also the only one with the technical background to understand what he was seeing. He'd been a signals analyst before the infantry. Someone knew he'd found it. Yes, and acted on it within 2 weeks of him pulling those records. Carver glanced at the folder. That document is the first physical evidence that connects the flagging system to the deaths. Everything I had was analytical. Inference, pattern analysis, data correlation. This is a printout from inside the system with an access log attached. She turned to the back of the folder. There was indeed an access log, a printed record of who had accessed the database around the time the flagging codes were applied. 3 usernames. One of them was Okafor's, pulling read-only access. The other 2 were encrypted designations that would need to be traced. The toxicology, she said. EIMS told me. If we can get the original lab results, we need the chain of custody record from the county lab. The original, not whatever went into the official file. Who's the third name on the chain of custody? He was quiet. Carver. The third name belongs to a deputy director at the Veterans Benefits Administration who has been on medical leave for 6 weeks. He said it carefully. A deputy director who, 3 days before Okafor died, sent an encrypted message through a personal account to an external address that traces back, through 4 layers, to Ariston Group. The highway opened up ahead of them. 4 lanes, fast, the kind of road that puts distance between you and things quickly. Who else knows what you know? She asked. Officially? Nobody. That's been the problem. He exhaled. The agencies that should be looking at this have Ariston-adjacent people in mid-level positions. Anyone who's pushed on Ariston has found their inquiry redirected or their data requests declined on technical grounds. I've had 2 contacts inside the VBA go quiet in the past 8 weeks. Not dead. Just quiet. Reassigned. Moved to positions where they don't see sensitive data. She understood what he was describing. She had operated in environments where institutional capture was the primary obstacle, where the structure you needed to use to fix a problem was the same structure that was maintaining the problem. It required a different approach, a different kind of entry point. What do you need from me? She asked. Formally? Nothing. You're a civilian. She looked at him. Right, he said. Forget I said that. He adjusted the mirror. What I need is someone who can walk into certain spaces that I can't, who has relationships in the military apparatus that I burned through my investigation, and who has the kind of credibility that doesn't come from a federal badge, because federal badges in this case are sometimes the wrong color. He paused. The Okafor family has asked for an independent review of the death. As a private citizen, as someone who knew him and can speak to his character and conduct, you could file a formal request for that review with the Army Inspector General's office, which would put the inquiry on record in a way that my civilian status can't. That would also put my name on a document that the people watching this case would see. Yes. She thought about Callahan at the gate, the 2 men at the edge of the memorial, the fact that someone had, at some point in the past 11 days, decided that Britta Callum was worth following. Give me 48 hours, she said. For what? To read everything in this folder, and to make 2 phone calls. She was back in Dunmore by 4 o'clock. Her apartment was the 2nd floor of a converted Victorian on Aldrich Street, with high ceilings and windows that stuck in the cold, and a radiator that made a sound like a small animal attempting escape. She'd lived here for 4 years since leaving the last post, and she had made it specifically unremarkable. No photos on the walls, no memorabilia, a bookshelf with paperbacks and medical references, and nothing that told a story about the person who'd lived the other life. She put the folder on the kitchen table and made coffee and sat down and read. It took 2 hours and 40 minutes. She read the way she'd been trained to read intelligence documents, not for story, but for structure, for the places where information was consistent versus the places where it smoothed over something that should have been rougher. She made notes on a legal pad in her own compressed handwriting, the kind that wouldn't be legible to most people, and she built a map on the paper of what was confirmed versus what was inferred versus what was missing. What was confirmed, a flagging system inside the VBA database, applied to at least 17 veterans across 4 states. What was inferred, the flagging system was connected to Ariston Group's database access contract. What was missing, the mechanism, the how. How did a flag in a database become a dead 26-year-old with falsified toxicology? She sat with that gap for a long time. Her phone rang at 6:43. Unknown number. She looked at it for 2 rings. Answered. Ms. Voss? The voice was male, middle-aged, the kind of cultivated neutrality that came from professional training or enough money to buy the affect. Or should I say, General? She said nothing. I'm going to assume you've spent the afternoon reading some very interesting documents. I want you to know that the people who prepared those documents had the best of intentions, but they were working with incomplete information. Who am I speaking with? Someone who would prefer this conversation to happen quietly before it needs to happen loudly. A pause. The folder Sergeant Callum gave you represents one interpretation of a program that exists for legitimate national security purposes. I understand it looks concerning from the outside, but the veterans whose records you're looking at were flagged for reasons related to security clearance maintenance, not whatever you're thinking. I'm thinking about potassium chloride. The pause this time was longer. That's a serious allegation. It's a serious compound. The toxicology report, which report, she asked. The one that went into the official file, or the one from the county lab that was altered before it got there? Another pause. Something had shifted in the quality of the silence. Less controlled, the sound of a man who had calibrated this conversation on a set of assumptions that had just come apart. I would strongly advise you, he said, to think carefully about what you plan to do with the information you have. There are people involved in this matter who have significant resources and a strong interest in keeping certain elements from becoming public. That's not a threat. It's a description of reality. I know what a threat sounds like, she said. That was one. She ended the call. She sat for a moment. Then she picked up her personal phone, a different one, a prepaid she kept charged in the bottom drawer of her kitchen for reasons she'd stopped explaining to herself, and dialed the second of the 2 numbers she'd promised Carver she would call. It rang 3 times. Then a voice she had not heard in 8 years, a woman's voice, dry and direct, and always 3 thoughts ahead of the conversation. I wondered when you'd call. Hello, Nora, Mara said. I've been watching the Okafor case from a distance. You're inside it now. Yes. How deep? Mara looked at the legal pad. The map of what was confirmed, what was inferred, what was missing. The gap at the center where a mechanism should have been. I have documents, she said. I have a DIA contact with parallel analysis. I have a connection to the family, a witness who needs protection, and a police officer who pointed a weapon at me this afternoon on a federal installation. Callahan. Nora said the name flat, like something she'd already filed. He's not independent. He's been doing work for Ariston-adjacent contractors for 3 years. Enforcement work, the kind that doesn't get reported. Mara went still. You know about Ariston? I've been building a file on them for 7 months. I needed a thread that connected the database access to the operational end. A beat. I think you just gave me one. Nora, who are you working with? Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, subcommittee level. Off the record for now, but there's a senator from Vermont who has been pushing for an inquiry into private contractor access to veteran records. She's been blocked twice by procedural maneuvers. A pause. She needs a witness, Mara. Someone credible, someone clean, someone who can speak to the pattern from both a medical and a military intelligence standpoint. Someone who can't be discredited by the usual means. Someone with a record that's hard to argue with. Someone who people look at and understand immediately that she doesn't have a reason to lie and doesn't have a history of causing trouble, and who has, in fact, spent the last 5 years making herself as unremarkable as possible. Nora's voice was careful now. Someone who a senator could put in front of a closed committee session and watch the room go quiet. Mara looked at the window. The street outside was dark, the evening having come while she was reading, the city doing what it did regardless, cars moving, a dog barking somewhere, a light going on in the apartment across the alley. She thought about Devin Okafor, the 8 months of Thursday evenings, the careful choosing of words, the thing he'd found and tried to tell her and hadn't gotten to. She thought about his mother in a black coat at a military memorial, holding herself with tremendous stillness. Send me what you have on Ariston, she said. Already did. Check the prepaid's inbox. A pause. Mara, they made a phone call to you tonight. How do you know? Because I've been monitoring their communication patterns, and one of them made an outbound call to a number registered to a burner cluster I'd flagged, as associated with Callaway Regional Medical Center staff. Nora's voice was quiet. They know who you are. They've known since the gate incident, probably since before, and they're scared. The call was them trying to assess how much you have. I didn't tell them. I know. But they'll assume the worst because they know what's in those files. She stopped. You need to move tonight. Not out of Dunmore. Not yet. Too obvious. But not at that apartment. Mara looked around the kitchen, the legal pad, the coffee cup, the folder on the table. I have somewhere, she said. Good. And Mara, a pause that in anyone else would have been hesitation, but in Nora was just the space before a thing that needed saying precisely. When this goes public, and it will, they are going to try to make it about you, about who you used to be, why you left, why you've been quiet. They are going to try to reframe the story so that the question is whether you're credible instead of whether 9 veterans were murdered. You need to be ready for that. I've been ready for that since I was 32 years old, Mara said. Good night, Nora. She ended the call and sat for exactly 1 minute, still. Then she stood, picked up the folder and the legal pad, went to the bedroom and opened the closet. In the back, behind a winter coat and 2 boxes she never opened, was a third box, flat and dark, with a combination lock she hadn't touched in 5.5 years. She turned the dial from memory. The box opened. Inside, beneath a layer of documents she'd sealed there the day she'd left the last post, was her military identification, her service record, letters and citations she'd never displayed and never discussed, and at the bottom, folded precisely, the uniform she had told herself she was done wearing. She did not take the uniform out, not yet, but she took the identification, and she took a specific letter, sealed, that bore the signature of a 3-star general and the date of her separation from service, which stated clearly and on record who she was and what she had done and the terms under which she had chosen to leave. She put those in her bag with the folder. Then she went to the window and looked down at the street. The car that had been parked 2 doors down when she came home was still there. Same position, engine off. But from this angle, in the light from the corner street lamp, she could see the faint orange glow of someone in the driver's seat. The phone in her bag, the main one, buzzed. She looked at it. A text from a Callaway regional number she didn't recognize. HR wants to see you Monday. Review of charge nurse assignment. Formal process initiated. She put the phone in her bag and looked at the car again. Then she picked up the prepaid and opened Nora's message. The Ariston file was 47 pages, and she would need a real computer to read the attachments. But the summary at the top loaded fine, and she read the first 3 paragraphs and then stopped at a name she did not recognize, listed as Ariston Group's primary liaison to the Veterans Benefits Administration. She did not recognize the name, but she recognized the employment history listed beneath it. 3 years at Dunmore PD, separated in good standing, hired by Ariston Group 8 months later. And below that, current secondary employment, listed as a consultant to the Callaway Regional Medical Center's Administrative Oversight Board, the board that Dr. Elliot Harmon reported to. She stood absolutely still in her kitchen, the prepaid in one hand, the folder in the other, the car on the street below, and the pieces of it arranging themselves into a shape she didn't like at all. A shape that meant the thing she was inside was larger than the VA, larger than a police officer at a gate, and had been in contact with the building she walked into every morning before she had any idea it was watching her. Her bag was already packed. She picked it up, turned off the kitchen light, and went to the back stairs. The back stairs of the Victorian led out into a narrow alley that ran between Aldrich Street and the parallel service lane behind the row of buildings. Mara had walked it twice in 4 years. Once when her front door lock had jammed in February, and once when she'd needed to move a large piece of furniture, and she had, without consciously deciding to, noted the exit geometry the first week she'd moved in. Old habits did not require maintenance. They simply waited. She moved through the alley at a pace that was not hurrying, because hurrying in a dark alley at night was a signal, and the point was to be unremarkable. The cold had sharpened since sunset, and her breath came in small visible bursts that she kept measured. At the end of the alley, she turned north, away from the car on Aldrich, and walked 3 blocks before she flagged down a cab, not an app, because apps created records, and gave the driver an address 6 blocks from where she actually intended to go. Randall Eames had a house in the Millcroft neighborhood that he'd bought when his wife was still alive and hadn't gotten around to selling. She knew this because he'd mentioned it twice in the last 8 years, both times in the context of things he didn't know what to do with. She also knew because she knew Eames that he would be awake, that he would have coffee made, and that he would not express any surprise at her appearing at his door after dark with a folder under her arm and a bag on her shoulder. He opened the door before she knocked. "I saw you coming up the street," he said. "You have a camera?" "I have a window and good eyes." He stepped aside. "Come in." The house smelled like old books and the specific coffee that came from a percolator that had been running most of the day. He led her through to the kitchen without ceremony and poured 2 cups without asking and put the sugar on the counter because he remembered that she used it, and the small specific knowledge of that was, in the context of this evening, more stabilizing than it had any right to be. She put the folder on the table and told him about the phone call, the text from HR, and what she'd found in Nora's file about the Ariston liaison with the employment history connecting to Callaway Regional's administrative board. She told it in the order it happened, without editorializing, the way she'd been trained to brief: facts, sequence, implications. Eames listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd always valued about him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, "Harmon. He reports to the oversight board. The Ariston liaison consults to the board. That's 2 degrees of separation from a contractor we believe is connected to at least 9 veteran deaths. It also explains the HR action." He turned his cup in his hands. "If they're trying to move you out of trauma too, they're not trying to fire you. That would create a record and a potential wrongful termination claim. They're trying to reassign you somewhere you have less standing to ask uncomfortable questions, and less access to veteran patients." He looked up. "Callaway Regional has a veteran services wing," she said. "I've been doing intake assessments there on alternating Tuesdays for 18 months. If I'm floating to different units, I lose that access. I lose the relationship with those patients." Eames set his cup down with the careful control of a man who was genuinely angry and had decided not to perform it. "How many of your veteran patients have been flagged in that database?" "I don't know yet. I don't have access to the flagging codes from inside the hospital system." She opened the folder and slid the list toward him. "But if Ariston has a contract with the VBA covering this region, and they have a consultant on the hospital's oversight board, there's a possible connection between the flagging database and the hospital's patient record system." He studied the list. "You'd need someone inside the hospital's IT infrastructure to check that. I'd need someone I can trust who won't create a visible trail." She paused. "I have someone, but I need to be careful how I approach it, because if I'm being watched inside the hospital, any unusual access to the record system will flag." Eames nodded slowly. "How soon can Nora move on the Senate committee connection?" She said off the record for now. "The senator needs something that creates a formal opening, a filed complaint, an official inquiry request, something that gives the subcommittee a procedural basis to demand documents. The Inspector General request. Carver suggested it this afternoon. If I file a formal request with the Army IG for an independent review of Okafor's death, as a private citizen with documented connection to the deceased, that puts the inquiry on record." She looked at him across the table. "And it makes me a formal complainant, which gives me a level of protected status in terms of retaliation. It also makes you a target with a name on a government document. I'm already a target with a name. The car outside my apartment suggests they stopped caring about discretion." Eames looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his face that wasn't quite worry, more like the expression of a man looking at the distance between where they were and where something was going, and calculating whether the ground between was as solid as it appeared. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want you to take it as it's intended." "Go ahead." "You have built something here, 5 years. A life that's quiet and useful and uncomplicated, in the best sense. You treat people every day who need someone steady, and you are that for them." He paused. "If you step back into this, fully, officially, with your name on documents, it does not go back. You know that." "I know that." "The uniform is in a box." "It is." "Mara." He said her name with the weight of 22 years. "Once they know who you are, all of it, everything changes. The way people look at you at that hospital, the way that department sees you, the life you put together." She looked at her coffee cup. Devin Okafor was 26 years old, she said. He was murdered because he found a spreadsheet. And before him, 8 others that we know about. All of them young. All of them discharged and trying to make something that worked. She looked up. I put the uniform in a box because I was tired. Not because I stopped believing what it meant. She picked up her cup. I'll file the IG request in the morning. She slept in the guest room on Millcroft Street, which had an old quilt and a window overlooking a yard where nothing had been planted in years. The soil just dark and turned and patient. She slept 4 hours, which was enough, and woke before the alarm she hadn't set out of a habit her body had maintained regardless of what she told it. At 6 a.m., she called Carver from the prepaid. The Ariston connection to Callaway Regional, she said when he answered. How does it fit with what you have? A pause. It fits like a key. She could hear him moving, a door, the background change of a man stepping somewhere more private. If they have an advisory position on the hospital's oversight board, they have visibility into patient data policies, including how veteran medical records are shared with the VBA for benefits coordination, which is a legitimate data sharing agreement. That also creates a pipeline between the hospital's patient records and the VBA database. He stopped. If a veteran patient at Callaway Regional is receiving benefits coordination, their health records go through the VBA pipeline, and the VBA pipeline goes through Ariston. She absorbed this. So they don't need to access military records or IG complaints to build a risk profile. They just need someone to go to the VA for benefits. Apply for benefits, enroll in a veteran services program, do an intake assessment with a veteran services nurse. He stopped. She stopped too. The intake assessments, she said. Yeah. The Tuesday assessments, 18 months of them. She sat with what that meant for exactly 3 seconds before moving past it, because the productive thought was not they used me, but I know what they did, and I can show it. I need to know if any of the 17 names on the list have records at Callaway Regional, she said, without triggering a visible records inquiry. I have a contact at the Pennsylvania Health Data Exchange who owes me significantly. I can run a blind cross-reference. It won't touch the hospital's internal system directly. A pause. 12 hours. Do it. She hung up and sat on the edge of the guest bed and thought about the 17 names. 9 of them dead. 8 still living, somewhere, with a flag next to their identification number in a database managed by a company that had a hand in every institution they touched. She thought about the 8 living ones, and something cold and purposeful settled in her chest. By 8:30, she was at the public library on Creswell Avenue, which opened at 8 and had desktop computers in the second-floor reference section that did not require a login. She used one to access the Army Inspector General's complaint portal and spent 40 minutes constructing a formal request for independent review. Careful, precise, grounded in documented facts rather than inference. The discrepancy between the county toxicology results and the official VBA report, the chain of custody anomaly with the deceased name, the absence of the cardiac condition from Okafor's service medical file. She attached what she legally could, her own affidavit of relationship to the deceased, her professional credentials, her contact information. She did not attach the folder documents. Not yet. Those would come through Nora's channel with proper classification handling. She filed the request at 9:17 a.m. and felt for the first time since Saturday afternoon at the Memorial Gate that something was moving in the right direction. Her regular phone buzzed at 9:45. Petra Nguyen from Trauma 2. She answered. Hey. Petra's voice had the careful tone of someone who had information they didn't know the right way to deliver. I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to just tell me if it's none of my business. Ask. HR scheduled your reassignment review for Monday, but also, and this is the part that feels weird, someone from hospital administration came into the bay this morning and asked Delgado about your patient interaction patterns, specifically about veteran patients. Delgado didn't tell them anything, but he came and found me right after because he didn't know what to make of it. Mara looked at the library's tall windows, pale morning light. A woman at the next table reading a paperback novel with careful attention. What exactly did they ask? She said. Whether you ever discussed patients' personal situations with them outside of clinical contexts. Whether you'd encouraged them to share information with you about their service histories or benefits claims. A pause. It sounded like they were trying to build a case for something. Patient confidentiality violation, maybe. or something that looks like overstepping professional boundaries. There it was. Not just the reassignment, the setup for a reason to reassign, a documented cause that would make the action look like internal HR process rather than retaliation. If they could establish even the appearance that she'd been improperly mining veteran patients for information, they could justify removing her from the Veteran Services Program and pull her hospital credentials into question. "Petra," she said, "I need you to do something, and it may feel odd. Okay? Write down everything you just told me. Date, time, who came to the Bay, what they asked Delgado, word for word as best he remembers it. Send it to your personal email, not hospital email. Do it today." A beat. "Mara, what's going on?" "I'll tell you when I can. Right now, what I can tell you is that documenting what happened this morning matters. Can you do that?" "Yes." No hesitation. This was what she'd always valued about Petra, the absence of performative uncertainty when something was real. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine. Don't discuss this with anyone except Delgado, and tell Delgado the same." She hung up and sat for a moment, recalibrating. They were moving faster than she'd expected, which meant something had shifted in their assessment of the situation. They were no longer trying to manage her quietly, which meant they'd decided the risk of what she might do was greater than the risk of visible action against her, which meant they were scared. She left the library and walked 6 blocks west to where she'd arranged to meet Carver, a diner on Cresswell with a view of 2 streets and booths in the back with high wooden dividers. "I was already there, in the back booth, with coffee and the look of a man who had been up since very early." "Something happened this morning," he said before she sat down. She sat. "Tell me." "Britta Callum." He kept his voice level, which took visible effort. "She made it to Harrisburg last night. She's at her sister's. But someone was at her apartment this morning before 7. Neighbor saw them. 2 men, civilian dress, told the neighbor they were doing a wellness check from the VA office. They went inside." Mara's jaw tightened. "She wasn't there." "No, but whatever she had in that apartment—" He stopped. "She's been handling the support group's records for the last year. Meeting notes, attendance, intake forms. If she kept copies of any of Okafor's communications with the group, she kept everything." Mara said it flatly, because she knew Britta's organizational habits from the group's Thursday sessions. She kept everything in a binder in her apartment because she was the most meticulous person in that room. She looked at the table. "We need to get her out. I can't predict. I have a contact at the U.S. Marshals Service. Not officially, but the kind of not officially that means something." He looked at her. "The question is whether we can move fast enough. If they're at her apartment now, they know she's not there. They'll start tracing where she went. How long to get a protective arrangement in place? Real protection? With formal status? Weeks." He turned his coffee cup. "Informal? I can make a call today that would get someone watching her location by tonight. But that's exposure for my contact." "Make the call." She looked at him steadily. "Carver, how solid is what we have for a formal proceeding?" He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant he was adding something up. "The IG request creates a record. The Okafor toxicology discrepancy, if we can get the county lab's original to compare, is potentially forensic evidence of a crime. The database documents from the folder are circumstantial without the internal Ariston records that Nora's building toward." He paused. "What we have right now is enough to open a formal investigation. What we need to complete a formal prosecution is the mechanism, how the flags became actions. We have the before and the after. We need the middle." She thought about this, about the gap she'd identified the night before, the how. The part that wasn't in the folder, that Okafor had probably been close to finding before someone decided to stop him. "The chain of custody record from the county lab," she said. "The name on it that's dead. Who was that person?" "A VBA records technician named Paul Greer, 61 years old, died of a stroke 4 months ago." "Did he have family?" Carver looked at her. "People who access records and alter them leave traces," she said. "Not in the system necessarily, but in their lives. A records technician who knew something was wrong and couldn't report it through official channels. Sometimes they tell someone, a spouse, a sibling, a colleague who they trusted." She held his gaze. "Did Greer have family?" "A daughter, lives in Reading." He was already pulling out his phone. "You think she knew?" "I think a 61-year-old man who was asked to falsify a record on a young veteran's death might have had trouble sleeping, and I think people who have trouble sleeping sometimes talk to someone at 3 in the morning. She picked up her coffee. Find the daughter. Carver went to reading that afternoon. Mara went back to Millcroft Street because Eames had called at noon to say that Colonel Vika Strand from the Army Criminal Investigation Division had reached out to him in response to the IG filing, faster than expected, because Strand had apparently already been watching the Okafor case from a distance, and the formal complaint had given her the procedural hook she needed. Strand arrived at Eames's house at 2 o'clock, and she was not what Mara had expected, which was its own reminder to stop having expectations. She was 43, black, with the compact efficiency of someone who spent most of their time operating in spaces where being underestimated was a resource rather than an obstacle. She came in, declined coffee, and put a tablet on Eames's kitchen table without preamble. "I've read the IG filing," she said. "I've also read the Okafor case file, the official one, and 3 things in it are wrong. Not unclear, not incomplete, wrong, in ways that require deliberate action." She looked at Mara. "You have the original folder." "Yes." "I need it logged into evidence, properly, with chain of custody from the point of transfer so it's admissible." She paused. "That means I need you to walk me through exactly how it came to you and where it's been since." Mara walked her through it. Britta, the courtyard, the transfer, the library, Eames's kitchen. Strand listened with the same quality Eames had. Absorptive, non-reactive, processing. "Sergeant Callum," Strand said when she finished. "She needs to give a formal statement. That means coming out of informal hiding and into a protected witness process. Can you arrange that? The CID can initiate it, but it requires the U.S. Marshals to execute, and the Marshals' involvement requires a formal case number from a federal prosecutor." Strand looked at her carefully. "I have an AUSA in Philadelphia who has been looking for a case to put Ariston Group inside. The Okafor connection, if we can establish it forensically, is that case." "The toxicology," Mara said. "Yes, but also—" Strand slid the tablet across the table. On the screen was a photograph of a document, a standard VA benefits coordination form, the kind that triggered the data sharing agreement between hospital patient records and the VBA database. "I pulled every benefits coordination form filed from Callaway Regional's Veteran Services Wing in the past 18 months. Cross-referenced the filing nurse's credentials." Mara looked at the form, at the nurse credentials field. Her own name, her own license number. 43 forms, Strand said. 43 veteran patients whose records went through the VBA pipeline because of benefits coordination initiated during intake assessments. She paused. 11 of those 43 names appear in the flagging database. The kitchen was very quiet. Mara sat with that for a long moment. The intake assessments. 18 months of Tuesdays. She had sat across from 43 people who came in carrying the specific invisible weight of veterans trying to access the system that was supposed to help them. And she had helped them access it. And in doing so, she had, without knowing, without consent, without any way to have known, handed their names to the machinery that was watching them. 11, she said. 6 of the 11 are on your list of 17 from the folder. 5 are additional names we didn't have before. Strand's voice was careful, but not soft. She understood the weight of what she was putting on the table. None of the 11 have died. Yet. The word hung. We need to flag those 11 for immediate attention, Mara said. Her voice was steady. The steadiness was not effortless, but it was real. If there's a timeline, if the flagging precedes action by a predictable interval, we think the window is between 3 and 6 weeks from flagging. Strand picked up her tablet. The most recently flagged name on the list from your intake assessments. The form was filed 11 days ago. Mara did the math. That's inside the window, she said. Yes. Strand met her eyes. I need that person's location and contact information, and I need it in the next hour. Mara was already pulling her records on the prepaid. She had kept a personal copy of intake notes, clinical rather than administrative, that didn't go through the hospital system. She found the most recent form. A veteran named Marcus Aldis, 29 years old, former Army Ranger, currently residing in a rental apartment in South Dunmore and receiving outpatient physical therapy at a clinic on the east side for a service-connected knee injury. She read the address and contact number to Strand, who entered it into her tablet. I'm going to dispatch someone to his location today, Strand said. under the guise of a benefits follow-up. We cannot tell him what this is actually about yet without risking him reacting in a way that alerts whoever is watching him. He has a right to know he's in danger. He has a right to be alive tomorrow. Strand held her gaze. When we have protective measures in place, we tell him, not before. It was the kind of logic that was correct and wrong at the same time, and Mara had encountered it enough times in enough context to know that the argument was a luxury and the timeline was not. Fine, she said. But the minute protective measures are in place, the minute, Strand agreed. Holt. Carver called it 5:47. The daughter, he said. Eleanor Greer, 53, works as a pharmacist in Reading. I spoke with her for 40 minutes at her kitchen table. His voice had something in it, not quite emotion, but the sound of a man who had heard something he hadn't expected to hear and was still processing it. Her father called her 4 months before he died. Not in the weeks before. 4 months before. Because something happened at work. What happened? He was told to update a record. He was told specifically what to change given the access credentials of the dead account, someone else's login, someone who'd left the department, and told that this was standard records maintenance that had fallen through administratively. He was told it by someone in his supervisory chain. Carver paused. He did it. And then he told Eleanor because he was not comfortable and he needed to tell someone, and his wife had passed 3 years before. Did he know what the record was for? He knew the name, Okafor. He'd seen the case come through because it had been flagged for expedited processing. Deaths under 40 received automatic expedited review in his department. He knew the young man had died, and he knew the number he was changing was wrong. Mara said nothing. Eleanor kept the voicemail, Carver said. Her father left her a voicemail that night after they'd spoken. 2 minutes and 14 seconds. He describes the record change, the supervisor's name, the credentials he was given, and the date. A pause. He says it because he wants it on record somewhere. He says, and I'm going to quote this exactly, I want somebody to know, in case this ever matters, that I didn't think it was right and I did it anyway, and I'm sorry for that. The kitchen at Eames's house was very still. The supervisor's name, Mara said, Raymond Voss. He stopped. No relation. I checked immediately. What's his current position? Senior Program Director, Ariston Group, Mid-Atlantic Division. There it was. The mechanism. The middle part that connected the flag to the action, to the falsified record, to the death. Carver. She kept her voice flat and even, because the alternative was not flat or even, and this was not the moment. Eleanor Greer needs to be protected, tonight. I've already called the marshal's contact. He's in motion. And the voicemail. She's sending me the audio file in the next 20 minutes. He was quiet for a second. Mara, this is it. The chain of custody, the voicemail, the supervisor's name at Ariston, the flagging database, the toxicology discrepancy. This is a prosecutable case. Not yet, she said. Not until we have the AUSA and the committee and everyone in position simultaneously. If any piece of this moves prematurely, I know, he exhaled. Strand? She's here. She's already moving on Aldous. Nora? I'll call her now. She called Nora while Strand used the other room and Eames stood at the kitchen counter with his coffee and the patient stillness of a man who had served in enough situations to understand that the most useful thing he could do in this moment was stay out of the way and be present. Nora answered on the first ring. I need to move the timeline, Shah, Mara said. We have the mechanism. Supervisor name at Ariston. Voicemail from a deceased records technician describing the record falsification on Okafor's toxicology, employment history connecting Ariston to Callaway Regional's Oversight Board, a living flagged veteran inside the 3 to 6 week action window. She stopped. How fast can your senator move? Nora was quiet for 4 seconds. If I call her tonight, and she calls her chief counsel tonight. Mara, a Senate subcommittee can't convene on 12 hours. Not a full hearing, a closed session, a preliminary proceeding that creates a formal record and gives the AUSA in Philadelphia the Senate referral they need to open a federal case. She paused. Nora, there is a 29-year-old veteran in an apartment in South Dunmore who may have 3 weeks to live if this doesn't move. What does your senator need to make the call tonight? A pause. A formal written summary. Documented sources. Your name on it. You'll have it in 2 hours. She spent the next hour and 40 minutes at Eames's kitchen table, drafting. The legal pad became a formal document on Eames's aging laptop, clear, sourced, structured the way she'd written briefings, when briefings had sometimes been the difference between people living and not. She named the sources she could name. She attached what Carver had sent her from the county lab's public records. She described her own role, the intake assessments, the 43 forms, the unwitting connection, without softening it, because softening it would give them something to argue about later. She signed it with the name she'd been born with and had last used officially in a theater of operations in 2019. Major General Mara Whitmore, United States Army, retired. She sent it to Nora at 8:03 p.m. Nora replied 4 minutes later with a single line. Senator Dawes is reading it now. Mara put down the phone and looked at Eames. Now we wait, she said. He nodded and went to heat up something that passed for dinner, and she sat at the table in the quiet kitchen while outside the temperature dropped and the city went on doing what it did. And somewhere in South Dunmore, a 29-year-old man who had no idea any of this was happening was watching television in his apartment, and somewhere across the city. The car outside her building on Aldrich Street was probably still parked in the same spot, waiting for her to come home. Her phone rang. Not the prepaid, the regular phone. The hospital number she'd been issued when she started at Callaway Regional 3 years ago. The caller ID read Dr. E. Harmon. She stared at it for 3 rings. Eames turned from the stove. She answered. Mara. Harmon's voice was different than it had been in his office. The administrative neutrality was gone, replaced by something she recognized after a second as the specific timbre of a man who had just been told something that frightened him. I need you to listen to me very carefully. I'm listening. I didn't know. He stopped. I need you to understand that when I agreed to the board advisory arrangement, I did not know what Ariston was. I knew them as a data management contractor. I was told they were restructuring veteran services intake to improve efficiency. She said nothing. Mara, someone just called me. Someone from Ariston, someone I've only spoken to twice before, and they said... He stopped again, and the stop had something in it that she was now interpreting correctly as fear. Not organizational fear, personal fear. They said there's a package being compiled, evidence of clinical impropriety, patient data violations, and that if the hospital's administration doesn't take action to remove the source of the problem, they'll take it to the state medical board themselves. The source of the problem. You. His voice was quiet. Mara, they're going to come after your license. She kept her expression off her face, which was easy because she was alone, which was the only reason she let herself feel what she felt for exactly 2 seconds before putting it somewhere useful. Elliot, she said, using his first name for the first time in 3 years. Do you know what Raymond Voss is? A pause. His name is in Ariston's organizational chart, she said. Senior Program Director, Mid-Atlantic. He's the person who instructed a records technician to alter Devin Okafor's toxicology report 4 months before that technician died. She paused. There is a voicemail in federal hands right now in which the technician describes this event, names Voss, and describes the credentials used to make the record change. That voicemail is being reviewed tonight by a Senate subcommittee. The silence on the other end was very long. The package they're threatening to compile about clinical impropriety, she continued. If they compile it, they'll need to explain how they know the details of my clinical practice, which will require them to explain the Ariston Hospital Board connection, which will require them to explain what they were doing with veteran patient data. She paused. Elliot, I'm going to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. Okay. His voice was barely above a murmur. The administrative visitor who came to Trauma 2 this morning, asking Delgado about my patient interactions. Who sent them? A beat. It came from the board. I was told it was a routine audit. Was there anything routine about it? A longer beat. No. She thought for a moment, then, I need you to write down exactly what happened today. The call you just received, the name of who called you, the request they made, and the audit instruction from the board. Send it to your personal email with a timestamp. She paused. And Elliot, don't call them back tonight. She ended the call. Eames put a bowl of soup in front of her and sat down across the table. Harmon, he said. They threatened his hospital if he didn't move against me. He called to warn me. She picked up the spoon. He's scared, but he's not complicit. I think. You think. I think. She started eating because her body required maintenance regardless of circumstances, and she hadn't eaten since morning. If Harmon cooperates, he's a witness to the board-level coercion. That's another chain in the link. She looked at the soup, which was from a can but was hot and required no thought. How many people need to be scared before this unravels? Usually just enough of the right ones, Eames said. Her prepaid buzzed. Carver. She read the message. Aldous apartment. Our contact got there at 7:30. No one home. Neighbor says a man came by in the afternoon, said he was from the VA, and Aldous left with him. Phone going to voicemail. She set the prepaid down on the table. Eames read her face. What? Marcus Aldous, she said. The flagged veteran. He's gone. Marcus Aldous, she said. The flagged veteran. He's gone. The soup went cold while she made calls. The first was to Strand, who answered on the second ring with the clipped alertness of someone who had not been sleeping anyway. Mara read her Carver's message word for word and heard, in the silence that followed, the specific quality of a trained investigator recalculating its speed. The contact who went to the apartment, Strand said. What time? 7:30. Neighbor said the VA man came in the afternoon, so somewhere between noon and 7, rough window. That's before the senator read your summary, before anyone on our side made a visible move tonight. Strand's voice was precise and tight, which means this wasn't reactive to what we did tonight. They were already moving on Aldous. They've been inside the timeline the whole time, Mara said. They knew when he was flagged. They knew the window. Or they accelerated it because of the memorial, because of Callahan's incident at the gate. A pause. Someone in that network saw the footage. Mara hadn't thought about footage. She thought about it now. The gate at Fort Keswick, a crowd of people with phones, a police officer raising a weapon at a civilian during a military memorial. The era of a thing happening without a record of it was long over. Is there footage? She asked. There's footage, Strand said flatly. It's been circulating on veteran community forums since approximately 4 o'clock this afternoon. It's not wide yet, but it's moving. You can see Callahan, you can see the weapon, and you can hear Colonel Eames say the name. Mara closed her eyes for 1 second. How much of it? Enough. The exchange at the gate before I arrived is cut off. But the confrontation in the courtyard, the weapon, the name, your approach, Callahan lowering the arm, that's all there. Strand's voice shifted slightly. Mara, when the name gets connected to the face, this becomes a different kind of story, a much louder one. I know. The kind that's hard to control the shape of. I know that too. She opened her eyes. Right now I need Marcus Aldous. Everything else is noise until we know where he is. His phone carrier? Carver's on it. He needs a court order. He'll have one in 40 minutes. I'm calling the AUSA now. Strand was already moving, the sound of her pace audible. Mara, the footage. When it breaks wide, and it will, they are going to come at you from every direction at once. The hospital, Ariston, Callahan's department, people in the VBA who've been protecting this. You understand that? Yes. Do you have legal representation? She hadn't thought about that either. She made a mental note that was less a note and more a spike she would deal with later. I'll handle it. Handle it tonight. Strand hung up. Eames was watching her from across the table. He hadn't spoken since she'd read the message, which was its own kind of useful. Aldous, she said. Former Army Ranger, South Dunmore, a man came to his door in the afternoon saying he was from the VA. He left with him. Voluntarily? Neighbor didn't indicate otherwise. No sign of struggle. She thought about this. A ranger doesn't go voluntarily with a stranger unless they either know them or the stranger presents something credible. A badge, maybe. Or credentials that look official. Callahan, Eames said. She'd had the same thought. Callahan or someone operating in the same network. The Ariston-adjacent enforcement work Nora mentioned. Contracted enforcement, the kind that doesn't get reported. She picked up the prepaid and called Carver back. The man who came to Aldous's door. Did the neighbor describe him? Carver's voice was strained in a way she hadn't heard before. White male, 50s, civilian clothes, showed something in a folded case to Aldous through the door. Neighbor couldn't see what it was. Aldous opened the door, they talked for maybe 2 minutes, and he left. He had a jacket on, no bag. No bag. So he didn't plan to be gone. That's how I read it. And he has no reason to distrust someone showing what looks like a federal credential because he's been working through the VA system in good faith for 18 months. She stood up from the table because sitting wasn't working. Carver, what's the physical therapy clinic he uses? Eastside, why? Because if someone wanted to intercept him in a way that looked routine, they'd pick a location he knows. Not his apartment, too visible to neighbors. Somewhere he goes regularly, somewhere the approach would look like a scheduled appointment. She thought about the intake forms. His Thursday appointment at the clinic. She'd noted it in her records because he'd mentioned scheduling conflicts with the support group. Check the clinic. Check whether anyone called ahead to set up a meeting in his name. She heard him pulling up something. A pause. Yeah, he said slowly. Clinic manager got a call this afternoon from someone identifying themselves as a VA case coordinator. Said Aldis's benefits review required an in-person meeting and asked if they could use a consultation room at the clinic after hours. A beat. They used the room from 4 to 4:45. Clinic manager saw Aldis leave with 2 men. She thought it was legitimate. Mara stood absolutely still. 4:45, she said. Where do 2 men take someone from a physical therapy clinic at 4:45 in the afternoon when they want them to go somewhere without making noise? Somewhere accessible, somewhere they have control of the environment, somewhere that doesn't require explaining why a 30-year-old walks in the door. Carver's voice was working through it the same way hers was. A facility they control, or one they have access to. Ariston has facilities? They have 3 regional offices. The one in Dunmore is on Commerce Drive, Business Park. 6 o'clock, it's empty. He stopped. That's where I'd go. Get Strand that address, now. She was already putting on her coat, so Eames drove. She hadn't asked him to, and he hadn't offered. He simply picked up his keys and was at the door before she was, which was the most useful thing anyone had done all evening. Commerce Drive was a 12-minute drive from Millcroft in normal traffic. At 9:15 at night, the roads were clear, and Eames drove with the particular economy of a man who understood that speed and visibility were often in tension and had made his choice between them. Strand called at 9:22. I have an agent at the Commerce Drive address in 8 minutes. Do not go in ahead of them. Understood. Mara, I mean it. I heard you. She looked out the window. The city moved past in its ordinary configurations. Lit windows, parked cars, the occasional pedestrian insulated against the cold. A world going about its business, while somewhere in a business park, a 29-year-old man who had served 2 deployments was sitting across from people who had decided he was a liability. What do they want from him? Eames asked, not taking his eyes off the road. I don't know, she said. Maybe they think he has documents Okafor gave him. Maybe they want to know how much he's shared and with whom. Maybe they just want to assess how much noise he'd make if they... She stopped. If, Eames said. If, she agreed. They turned onto Commerce Drive at 9:24. The business park was the specific kind of anonymous. Low, flat buildings, parking lots under bright security lights, a few cars scattered outside offices still running late. Ariston's regional office was the 3rd building on the left, a glass-fronted unit with the name on an exterior sign in clean sans serif. Nothing remarkable. The visual language of a company that did not want to be noticed. 2 lights on inside. One in the front office, one in what looked like a conference room in the back. Eames parked 2 buildings down without being told. The federal vehicle arrived 90 seconds later. A black SUV, 2 agents, the quiet professional urgency of people who did this for a living. They made contact with Strand by radio, then approached the building while Mara and Eames sat and watched from the car. The next 8 minutes were the kind that felt longer. She watched the agents at the front door, observed entry, some exchange, then one agent around the side while the other remained at the front. Then the front door opened and there was motion inside, then stillness. Her phone buzzed. Strand. Aldis is here, unharmed, 2 men in custody, local law, we're processing. She breathed out. Then, 40 seconds later, one of the men is carrying Dunmore PD credentials. Retired. Name is Thomas Brower. Check your Ariston file under contractor personnel. She opened Nora's file on the prepaid, scrolled to the contractor section. Thomas Brower. Former Dunmore PD, 14 years, retired. Hired as Ariston Regional Field Coordinator 18 months ago. Same department as Callahan, same timeline. She sent the connection to Strand without comment. Strand's reply came back in 2 minutes. Callahan and Brower were partners for 6 years. Brower retired 3 months after Callahan's 7th internal complaint was dismissed. The machinery of it was becoming visible now, the way a mechanism looks when you take the cover off. Not beautiful, just functional, gear connecting to gear, everything turning because someone designed it to. Marcus Aldis was driven to a federal field office by the second agent, while Brower and his associate were transported separately. Mara waited in Eames's car until Strand called again at 10:15. "He's okay," Strand said, shaken. They told him it was a benefits compliance interview, asked him questions about his service record, his contact with the VA outreach office, who he'd spoken to about his claims. He thought it was unusual, but he wasn't. He didn't know he was in danger. Did they get anything from him? He mentioned the support group, the Thursday sessions. He mentioned your name as the intake nurse who helped him access benefits. A pause. He also mentioned, because they asked him directly whether Okafor had ever given him any documents, that Okafor had sent him a text message 3 weeks before he died. He showed them the phone. Mara's jaw tightened. What was in the text? He didn't show them the text. He showed them the phone. Brower looked through it and apparently found what he was looking for. Strand's voice was careful. The text was a link to a secure file storage address. Okafor sent it to 4 people from the support group, Aldis, Britta Callum, and 2 others we're now trying to identify, as a backup. In case something happened, a backup file. Hosted on an encrypted civilian platform. Brower photographed the link from the phone. Strand stopped. Mara, if they have that link and they crack the encryption, they'll know everything Okafor intended to preserve. And if they know everything Okafor intended to preserve, they'll know how much of the mechanism is documented. Can we access the file first? We need Aldis's cooperation to retrieve it, and we need a technical team to handle the encryption. That's a 6 to 8 hour process at minimum. She paused. But Ariston has resources too. If Brower gets that photo to someone tonight, you have Brower in custody. His associate isn't talking yet, and I don't know who else had eyes on that phone exchange. Strand's voice was the particular flatness of someone managing a situation with too many variables. I'm going to be straight with you. Tonight we stopped 1 thing and created 3 more. Brower in custody is going to alert someone in the network within hours. The footage of the Fort Keswick incident is going to be on regional news by morning, and I have an AUSA in Philadelphia who is ready to move but needs the Ariston internal records that Nora's committee contact hasn't formally obtained yet. What does she need from the committee? A subpoena for Ariston's internal communications, specifically the flagging database administration and the chain of custody on the VBA records coordination contracts. Strand's voice tightened slightly. Senator Dawes needs to sign it tonight. Has she read the summary? She read it. She called her general counsel. General counsel said wait for more documentation. Strand stopped. Mara. She's not going to move on a subpoena tonight on the basis of a retired general's summary memo, even a good one. She thought for 3 seconds. What would move her? Silence. What does she need to see that she hasn't seen? She needs to hear the voicemail, Strand said quietly. Eleanor Greer's voicemail. If she hears Paul Greer describing what he did and why and who told him to do it, she can take that to her general counsel, and she has primary source material. A beat. Carver has the audio file. I know he does. If that file goes to the senator's office tonight, it goes through proper channels or it's inadmissible. It goes through proper channels, yes. Strand's voice was patient. Which is why I need Carver to formally transfer it to CID custody tonight, as part of the Okafor independent review, which is now an active formal inquiry as of 6 hours ago. And then I transmit it through the Inspector General's office to the subcommittee as supporting evidence of the IG filing. She stopped. It's not fast, it's right. How long? If everyone moves tonight, 4 hours. Senator's office could have it by 2 a.m. It was 10:27. Mara did the math. Make the calls, she said. I'll get Carver moving. She didn't sleep. There was no version of this night that contained sleep. She and Eames drove back to Millcroft Street, and she sat at the kitchen table and made calls and reviewed documents and coordinated the movement of information between people who were each holding one piece of a thing that only made sense when assembled. Carver transferred the audio file to Strand's formal custody at 11:40. Strand's office transmitted it through the IG chain at 12:15. At 1:08 in the morning, Senator Dawes's chief counsel called Nora, and Nora texted Mara a single word: subpoena. She put the phone down and sat with that for a moment. In the living room, Eames had fallen asleep in the armchair with his reading glasses still on, a paperback open on his chest. He was 61 years old and had driven her around a city at night for reasons she hadn't had to explain, and she was aware that this was not nothing. She did not wake him. She went to the guest room, sat on the bed, and opened her laptop to find that the Fort Keswick footage was no longer on veteran community forums. It was on 3 regional news websites with the kind of headline that made her stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with the investigation. Decorated nurse confronted at military memorial by armed officer, community calls for answers. She read the first 2 paragraphs. The footage was the courtyard moment, Callahan's weapon, the approach, the arm going down. The name spoken by Eames had been picked up clearly by someone's phone microphone. The stories had her name right. They had her title partially right. One source had said Major General, which was correct, and another had said former military commander, which was vaguer but not wrong. 3 of the 4 stories had already reached out to Callaway Regional Medical Center for comment. She didn't know what the hospital would say, and she didn't have the bandwidth to think about it tonight. She closed the laptop, lay back on the bed fully clothed, and spent 90 minutes in a state that was not quite sleep and not quite wakefulness. The particular suspended state she'd learned in circumstances where rest and readiness had to occupy the same space. At 4:15, Strand called. "The subpoena is moving," she said, "but I need you at the federal field office at 7. The AUSA wants a formal interview, witness statement, on record, complete walkthrough of your involvement from Okafor's death to tonight." She paused. "He also wants you to know that what you've provided, in combination with Eleanor Greer's testimony and the Brower arrest, is sufficient to open a federal criminal investigation into Ariston Group." Mara sat up in the dark of the guest room. "Into the deaths," she said. "Into the deaths. Okafor specifically, and the pattern across all 9 confirmed cases. RICO consideration, potentially, given the organized nature of the flagging system." Strand's voice had the careful quality of someone trying not to sound more satisfied than the moment warranted. "Mara, this is real. This is moving. Aldous is safe?" "In federal custody for his own protection. He's been briefed. He's not happy, but he understands." "Britta?" "Marshals have her in Harrisburg. She's formally cooperating." She exhaled. "Callahan." A pause that lasted just slightly too long. "Callahan is the complicated part. He raised a weapon at a federal installation." "He did, and that's being processed through the Dunmore PD IA division and through federal charges related to the installation incident." Strand stopped. "But his attorney made contact with the AUSA's office tonight at 2 a.m. His attorney, offering cooperation, information about the Ariston-Dunmore PD relationship in exchange for consideration on the federal weapon charge." Strand's voice was neutral in a way that was doing a lot of work. "Callahan knows more than he's let on. He was inside the contractor relationship, not just adjacent. If he talks, he fills the gaps in the mechanism." Mara processed this. The man who had pressed a weapon toward her chest at a military memorial, who had spent 14 years operating without consequences, who was connected to a network responsible for 9 deaths, sitting across from a federal attorney at 2 in the morning, offering to trade what he knew for what he needed. "What's the AUSA's position?" she asked. "That it depends on what he actually has. They'll interview him this morning." A pause. "How do you feel about that?" It was a genuine question, not a procedural one, and Strand had asked it carefully. Mara recognized the care. "I feel like what I want is 9 families getting an answer," she said. "If Callahan provides that, the transaction is between him and the AUSA." She paused. "I want it noted formally that the weapon charge at Fort Keswick is not included in any cooperation agreement. Whatever else he gives them, that charge stands." "Noted. I'll make sure it's in writing." The federal field office was a 15-minute drive from Millcroft. She arrived at 6:50 before the AUSA and was met by a young agent named Torres who took her coat and her bag and brought her coffee that was better than she expected and showed her to a conference room with a view of a parking structure and a section of gray morning sky. She gave her statement for 3 hours and 40 minutes. The AUSA was a woman in her late 30s named Solace, who listened the way good lawyers listened, with the specific attention of someone building a structure in real time, noting the weight-bearing elements and the ones that needed reinforcement. She asked about the intake assessments with the focus of someone who understood that this was both Mara's connection to the victims and the element that Ariston had intended to use against her. "You didn't know," Solis said. "No. When you assisted those veterans in accessing the VBA system, I thought I was helping them," Mara said. "That's what the intake assessments were for. That's what I was told they were for. That's what I believed." She kept her voice level. If Ariston used that process as a mechanism to identify targets, they used a legitimate medical care function as a weapon. The liability for that is theirs. Solis nodded, writing. "The 43 intake forms I filed," Mara said. "Ariston will try to use them in their defense. They'll argue the data collection was a natural consequence of the VBA benefits pipeline, not targeted surveillance. I wanted on record that the flagging codes applied to 11 of those 43 patients were applied after the intake forms were processed by Ariston personnel without clinical basis. I have a medical basis to challenge every single one of those flags as outside the clinical information provided." Solis looked up. "Can you document that?" "I kept personal clinical notes from every intake session, non-administrative, not in the hospital system. The clinical information I recorded is significantly less than what appears in the VBA database records for those patients, which means Ariston supplemented the intake data with information from another source." She held Solis's gaze. "I'd like to know what source." Solis wrote for a moment. "That's a productive question for the subpoena return." "Yes, it is." The statement concluded at 10:40. Solis walked her out with the particular courtesy of someone who understood that what they'd just spent 4 hours building mattered. In the lobby, Mara's regular phone had 14 missed calls and 32 text messages, most from numbers she didn't recognize, and 3 from Petra Nguyen, and 1 from an unknown number that had left a voicemail she listened to standing in the federal field office lobby while Torres waited politely near the door. The voicemail was from Callaway Regional's Media Relations Office, informing her that the hospital was issuing a statement and had placed her nursing credentials under administrative review pending an investigation into patient privacy compliance, effective immediately. She deleted it. Torres drove her back to Millcroft in a federal vehicle, which was the first time she'd been driven by a federal agent since 2017, and she sat in the back and looked out the window at the morning version of the city. The same streets as last night, different light, everything the same and in the middle of changing. Eames had breakfast made when she came in, which was scrambled eggs and toast, and the paper, because he was the kind of man who still took the paper, and she sat down and ate and read while he refilled the coffee. "Nora called while you were out," he said. "The subpoena return from Ariston's servers is scheduled for this morning. Their legal team is already objecting on proprietary grounds." He sat. "She also said the footage has hit national news." Mara looked up from the paper. 3 networks. The name is connected to the face. They have your service record. He paused. The Dunmore PD issued a statement calling the Fort Keswick incident an isolated misunderstanding. Their Internal Affairs Division put out a comment about Callahan being placed on administrative leave pending review. Administrative leave. Not suspension, not charges. Administrative leave, which was the department's way of buying time while they figured out whether the man was going to help them or hurt them. "What's the veteran community saying?" she asked. "Loudly," Eames said. "The forums where the footage originated have been sharing your service record alongside the clip. Someone pulled your citations. Someone else found a photo from the 2017 ceremony." He was quiet. "It's not a small thing, Mara." She finished the eggs. "No. People are going to want to know the whole story." "They'll get it," she said, "when it's ready." Her phone rang. "Nora." "The subpoena return is in," Nora said without preamble. "Ariston's internal communications for the past 24 months. Senator Dawes's committee has 3 analysts on it now." a pause that had something in it. Mara, Raymond Voss, the supervisor who instructed Greer to alter the toxicology record, he's in those communications. Extensively. Another pause. And so is someone else. Who? A name I didn't expect. Nora's voice was doing something careful. A name that's going to change the scale of this significantly. Nora. The communications show a direct line between Ariston's flagging program and the Deputy Secretary of the Veterans Benefits Administration. Not the liaison, the Deputy Secretary himself. 12 months of communications directing the scope of the flagging program, approving the actions taken against specific veterans, and she stopped. And one communication 8 days before Devin Okafor died, specifically approving a resolution protocol for his case. The kitchen was very still. Resolution protocol. Does Solis have this? Mara asked. She will in 10 minutes. I'm calling her next. Nora's voice was quieter now. Mara, this is not a contractor operating outside the bounds of a government contract. This is a government official, a deputy secretary level official who authorized what happened to Okafor, to all of them. Mara put the coffee cup down on the table. The surface of the liquid moved slightly and then went still. How long before Ariston's legal team finds out what the subpoena returned? She asked. They already know the subpoena was executed. They don't know what's in the return. Their objection is pending. They'll know within hours that the objection failed. And when they know, every person connected to those communications will know that their name is in a federal record. Nora paused. Including the deputy secretary. Mara looked at Eames across the table. He had the expression of a man who had heard enough to understand what she'd just been told without hearing it himself. How quickly can the committee move on the deputy secretary? She asked. The subpoena for his communications is being drafted now. His office will receive it by end of business today. Nora was quiet for a moment. There's one more thing. The deputy secretary's chief of staff made 3 calls this morning. 1 to Ariston's legal team. 1 to a number registered to Thomas Brower's associate, the man who was with Brower at the clinic last night. She stopped. And 1 to Callaway Regional Medical Center's board of directors. The call to the board. The administrative review of her credentials placed this morning, effective immediately. They know the subpoena came back, Mara said, and they're trying to establish a counter-narrative before the story gets out. They're going to try to make this about me, about the intake assessments, about data privacy, about a nurse who exceeded her scope and created a scandal. Yes, Nora said, they need to discredit me before I testify in front of the committee. The committee hearing is being scheduled for Thursday, Nora said. 48 hours. Mara looked at the window. Morning light now, full and clear, the kind of light that showed everything. Then I have 48 hours, she said. There's something else. Nora's voice dropped slightly. Callahan's attorney, the cooperation offer. The AUSA interviewed him at 6 this morning. He talked. A beat. He confirmed everything about the Ariston-Dunmore PD contractor relationship. He confirmed Brower. He confirmed the mechanism, how the resolution protocols were executed on the ground, how veterans were approached, where they were taken, what was used. Her voice was very controlled. He also confirmed that the same protocol was scheduled for Marcus Aldis, and that there was a second name on this week's list. Mara went rigid. Who? She said. Nora said the name. It was a name Mara knew, a name from the Thursday support group sessions, a veteran she'd sat across from for 8 months, a person who had talked about their kids in the careful way of someone who had been away too long and was trying to find their way back. When? Mara said. The protocol was scheduled for tonight. The name was Victor Reyes, 44 years old, 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. Medically discharged after a blast injury, took partial hearing in his left ear and did something to his equilibrium that the VA's reports described clinically and that Victor described on a Thursday evening in St. Crispin's Community Hall as feeling like the ground was always trying to move out from under him. He had 3 kids, 8, 11, and 14, and a part-time job at a print shop on Clement Street, and a laugh that arrived without warning and filled whatever room it entered. He had been coming to the Thursday group for 7 months. He brought coffee sometimes, the cheap kind from the gas station, and always brought enough for everyone. Mara did not think about any of this for more than 4 seconds. She thought about it in the way you register something that matters, fully, clearly, without sentiment. And then she moved. "Address," she said. Nora gave it. Victor Reyes lived in a rental house on the north side of Dunmore, 12 minutes from Millcroft Street. Mara was already standing. "I'm calling Strand," she said. Already on it. She's dispatching." "How long?" 20 minutes minimum. They're across the city." 20 minutes. The protocol, whatever it was, had been scheduled for tonight, which was a wide window. But Callahan's cooperation interview had taken place at 6 in the morning, and it was now 11:15, and if anyone inside the network had ears on that interview, a sympathetic officer, a monitored call, any of the 100 ways that information moved in systems that had been corrupted long enough to build their own internal channels, the window might have already closed to something much shorter. "Eames," she said. He was already up. "Keys are in my hand." She called Strand from the car, gave her the address, confirmed she understood she was going ahead of the federal response, and that Strand confirmed it with the specific tone of a person who was unhappy with a decision and was making it anyway because the alternative was worse. She called Victor's phone 3 times on the drive. It rang through to voicemail each time, not unusual for a man with a hearing loss on one side who worked a print shop shift on Wednesday mornings. But the voicemail sound was not reassuring. Eames drove, and she looked out the window and thought about the mechanism Callahan had described in his cooperation interview, how it worked on the ground level, the part she still didn't have full detail on. She thought about the physical therapy clinic and Thomas Brower showing something in a folded case, and a veteran who had no reason not to trust a federal credential because he had served the country that credential represented and had come home and was trying, carefully and imperfectly, to build a life in which that service meant something. She thought about the word protocol. The word had a bureaucratic neutrality to it that was its own particular cruelty. It meant that somewhere, in a document she hadn't seen yet, there were instructions. Steps. A procedure. Someone had sat down and written out the steps by which a flagged veteran was to be approached, isolated, and killed in a manner that would appear natural, and they had called it a protocol, and they had approved it up a chain of command that ended at a desk in Washington with the deputy secretary's nameplate on it. That was the part that lived underneath the procedural urgency of this morning, underneath the legal and logistical machinery, underneath everything she was doing and needed to do. That a thing like this had been written down, approved, and executed 9 times before anyone found the thread. That the thread had been found by a 26-year-old signals analyst who had survived 2 combat deployments and died in his apartment because he'd been curious about a database anomaly. Eames turned onto Victor's Street. The house was a small 2-story with aluminum siding and a yard that had a bicycle leaning against the porch rail and a wreath on the door that had been there since December and was starting to look tired. Lights on in the front room, a car in the driveway she didn't recognize. "That car," she said. "It's not registered to Reyes," Eames said. He'd been running the plate on his phone while he drove, which she chose not to comment on. "Rental. Picked up yesterday at the Dunmore Airport location." She was out of the car before it fully stopped. She went to the front door and knocked. Not aggressively. A solid, purposeful knock, the kind that communicates presence. Then she stepped to the side of the door, the old reflex, because she didn't know what was inside. Footsteps. A pause. Then Victor's voice, slightly muffled. "Yeah? Victor? It's Mara Voss, from the Thursday group." A longer pause. The sound of movement, maybe 2 sets of it, the kind you could hear if you were listening for it. Then the door opened. Victor Reyes looked tired and confused, and something else, a kind of wariness that didn't match his usual expression, the settled look of someone who'd been disrupted and hadn't reoriented yet. He was in work clothes, jacket on, like he'd been about to go somewhere or had just come back. Behind him, visible through the doorway, a man was standing in the front room. Civilian clothes, 50s, the posture of someone who had prepared for this visit to go a specific way and was now recalculating. "Mara," Victor said. "What?" "I need you to step outside," she said. Calm, completely calm. "Right now, just out here with me." He read something in her face. Victor Reyes had 3 kids and partial hearing and a laugh that filled rooms, and he had also spent years in environments where reading faces quickly was survival. He stepped outside. The man inside moved toward the door. "Sir," Mara said, addressing him directly, through the open doorway. "My name is Mara Whitmore. I'm a retired United States Army Major General. I have federal agents 12 minutes out. I have a witness in protective custody who has provided a full account of the resolution protocol associated with Mr. Reyes's case file. I'm asking you to sit down." The man stopped. "Sit down," she said again. The voice from the Fort Keswick courtyard, the one she hadn't used in a long time and had apparently not lost any of. "Or you can stand, but either way you are not leaving this house until federal agents arrive, and the decision you make in the next 30 seconds is going to determine what the next several years of your life look like." He sat down. Victor turned to her with an expression that was working through several things at once. "Who is that?" he said. "He said he was from the VA. Benefits follow-up." "I know what he said." She kept the man in her peripheral vision. "Are you all right?" "I think so. We were talking. He was asking about the support group, who I'd spoken to, whether Devin had ever—" Victor stopped. "Devin. This is about Devin." "Yes," she said. "It's about Devin." He looked at her, and she let him look, and she watched the understanding arrive in his face. Not all of it, not the full shape of it, but enough. The bicycle against the porch rail, the tired wreath on the door, the 8 and 11 and 14-year-old who were somewhere in this house or nearby, living there Wednesday. "Okay," he said very quietly. "Okay." Federal agents arrived in 14 minutes. The man inside, identified as a private contractor named Stuart Ellery, with a background in pharmaceutical logistics that would later prove directly relevant, was taken into custody without incident. Victor sat on his front porch steps with a blanket someone produced from the federal vehicle and gave a statement that took 40 minutes, during which Mara stood at the edge of the yard and looked at the street, and did not let herself feel what she was feeling until there was space for it. There wasn't space for it for a long time after that. The next 48 hours had the quality of a sustained pressure system. Everything moving, nothing resolving, the barometric sense of something large about to break open. She slept in increments. She ate when Eames put food in front of her. She gave 2 more formal interviews, reviewed documents that Solis's team sent through the IG channel, and spoke 4 times with Nora about the shape of what the Senate subcommittee was building toward Thursday's closed session. The Ariston subpoena return produced 312 pages of internal communications. Stuart Ellery, the contractor taken from Victor's house, agreed to cooperate within 6 hours of his arrest, faster than anyone had anticipated, which Solis said usually meant someone was scared enough of what was above them to trade it quickly. What Ellery provided was the operational architecture, how the resolution protocols were designed, who designed them, who approved each execution, and what pharmaceutical compound was used in the field and how it was sourced through Ariston's logistics arm. Potassium chloride in a concentrated injectable form, deliverable in a clinical or semi-clinical setting, dispersing from tissue within a predictable window that a standard autopsy wouldn't catch unless it was specifically testing for the compound. It required medical knowledge to administer correctly and access to a setting where the administration would look routine. Victor's benefits follow-up interview, had it proceeded as planned, would have included a referral to an Ariston-contracted mobile health screening service for a routine physical. The screening van was currently parked on a street 2 miles from his house. The agents found it 40 minutes after Ellery's arrest. Inside was equipment that had no legitimate clinical purpose in a mobile screening context and a vial of a compound that the forensic team identified within 2 hours. 9 times this had worked. 9 veterans, 9 protocols, 9 death certificates reading cardiac event or accident, 9 families told that the person they loved had died of something ordinary. Mara sat with the forensic report for a long time when Solis sent it. Not reading it again. She'd read it twice. Just sitting with the weight of it being a document that existed, that would be entered into evidence, that would have numbers and dates and case identifiers next to 9 names. Devin Okafor was case 4. The Senate subcommittee's closed session took place on Thursday at 9 a.m. in a chamber in Washington that Mara had never been in, surrounded by people she had mostly communicated with through intermediaries for the past 4 days, testifying in front of 7 senators and their staffs, and a court reporter who took down everything with the specific efficient neutrality of someone who had heard a great deal and was paid not to react to any of it. She testified for 4 hours and 20 minutes. She told it the same way she'd told it to Solis. in sequence, grounded in fact, without editorializing. She described the intake assessments and what she'd understood them to be and what they had actually been used for. She described Devin Okafor, not as a case number, but as a person. The Thursday evenings, the careful choosing of words, the thing he'd found and tried to tell her, and the fact that he'd had the foresight to copy his documents and distribute the link to 4 people who had each, in their own way, kept it alive. She described the mechanism. She described the 11 flagged veterans from her intake assessments, the names she had put into a system in good faith, and that had been fed to a program designed to identify who among them might someday cause a problem for the people running it. Senator Dawes asked her, midway through the session, what she wanted the committee to understand that they might not already. She thought about it for a genuine moment, not performing thought, actually thinking, because it was a real question. That the men and women in that database weren't flagged because they were dangerous, she said. They were flagged because they were paying attention. They'd filed claims or asked questions or worked in offices where they could see things they weren't supposed to see. They were doing exactly what the system tells veterans to do. They were engaging with the institutions that are supposed to serve them. She stopped. The program didn't target troublemakers. It targeted people who believed the system would work if they worked with it. That's the part that needs to be understood. Because if we tell veterans to trust these institutions, and the institutions are this, then the trust is the weapon. The chamber was very quiet. She kept going. Devin Okafor was a signals analyst before he was infantry. He understood databases the way a mechanic understands an engine. He saw something wrong in a database that was supposed to serve the people he cared about, and he pulled on the thread because that's what someone with his training and his conscience would do. He didn't have a political agenda. He had a job he'd taken because he wanted to help people coming home. She paused. He was 26 years old. He had not been home long enough to stop being careful about it. She was aware, while she spoke, that this was the thing she'd been carrying since the morning she'd read the official report, and her stomach had dropped and she'd known, without being able to say how, that something was wrong. It had lived in her for 11 days as logistics and urgency and coordination, and underneath all of it, this, Devin Okafor, 26, who had come to Thursday evenings and chosen his words carefully and found something and tried to tell her. She had not been there to hear it. She could not change that. What she could do was be here, in this chamber, telling it clearly and completely, which was not a consolation, but it was what was true. The Deputy Secretary of the Veterans Benefits Administration, whose name was Leonard Farrow, was arrested at his office in Washington on Thursday afternoon, 2 hours after the closed session concluded. His arrest was not public for another 3 hours, during which his legal team filed 2 emergency motions that were both denied by 5 o'clock. By 6 o'clock, the story was on every national network, and his name was attached to the words federal charges and veteran deaths, in a combination that moved through the news cycle with the specific velocity of something that had been building pressure for a long time. Raymond Voss, Ariston Group's senior program director for the Mid-Atlantic Division, surrendered to federal agents at his home in Virginia on Thursday evening. He did not cooperate and did not speak to media and looked, in the single photograph taken as he was walked to a federal vehicle, like a man who had believed for a very long time that the structure around him would hold and was in the specific early moment of understanding it had not. Stuart Ellery's cooperation produced 8 additional names within Ariston's operational structure. The company's government contracts were suspended by Friday morning, pending federal review. All of them, not just the VBA agreement, which was a broader consequence than anyone had publicly predicted, and which sent a particular kind of signal through the contractor community that people who worked in that world would understand and discuss for years. Thomas Brower was charged with unlawful detention, conspiracy, and multiple counts connected to the resolution protocols. His cooperation offer, extended 48 hours earlier, was reviewed and partially accepted. The terms would be argued in a proceeding that would take months. Derek Callahan was charged with assault with a deadly weapon on a federal installation, civil rights violation, conspiracy, and multiple counts of abuse of authority connected to his role in the Ariston Enforcement Network. His cooperation agreement covered the conspiracy counts and received partial consideration on the civil rights violation. The assault charge at Fort Keswick was not included in any agreement. Mara had put that in writing, and Strand had made sure it stayed there. His arraignment was public record, and his photograph in civilian clothes looking significantly smaller than he had at a military gate with a weapon in his hand circulated widely. The Dunmore Police Department issued a statement expressing shock and commitment to accountability that the city's veteran community received with a skepticism that was, under the circumstances, appropriate. Dr. Elliot Harmon was interviewed by federal investigators and cleared of criminal involvement. The board advisory relationship had been presented to him as legitimate, and he had no documented knowledge of Ariston's operational activities. He retained his position at Callaway Regional, and in the weeks following would cooperate fully with the hospital's internal review of its board composition and contractor relationships, a review that resulted in 3 board members resigning. The administrative review of Mara's nursing credentials, initiated on Wednesday morning at the direction of those board members in coordination with the Deputy Secretary's Chief of Staff, was formally withdrawn on Friday afternoon. The hospital's legal team sent the withdrawal in writing, accompanied by a brief statement that it had been opened in error on the basis of incomplete information. She read the statement once and put it in a folder and did not think about it much because the administrative review had always been the least interesting of the things that had happened this week, and she had known from the moment it landed that it would eventually go away. What did not go away, and what she had known would not, was everything else. The story broke wide on Friday, not the subcommittee session, that was still classified in its specifics, pending the criminal proceedings, but the Fort Keswick footage, the arrests, the shape of what had happened, her name connected to the service record, the facts assembled by reporters who were very good at their jobs into a narrative that was mostly accurate and in some places more dramatic than the reality and in a few places more flattering. She did not read most of it. She read enough to know what was being said, and then she stopped because the story that was being told in the press was a version of the story, compressed, cleaned at the edges, the messy parts made more legible. And she had spent the last week inside the actual thing, and the gap between the two was too wide to look at for long without getting lost in it. What she did read was the piece that Devin Okafor's mother gave to a journalist who had asked if she wanted to speak. It ran Saturday morning, 1,100 words, and it was not about the investigation or the arrests or the political consequences. It was about Devin, about the child he'd been and the soldier he'd become and the person he'd been trying to be when he came home. The VA job, the Thursday evenings, the phone call where he'd told his mother he'd found something that bothered him and he was going to figure out what to do about it. She'd told him to be careful. He'd said he would. Mara read that part twice. Then she put her phone down on the kitchen table at Millcroft Street and looked out the window at the yard that hadn't been planted in years, and allowed herself the 2 minutes she'd been deferring since Commerce Drive, since Victor's porch steps, since the moment in the federal field office lobby when she'd deleted a voicemail about her credentials and kept moving because there was still too much to do. She was not a woman who cried easily or often. She cried now, briefly, in the way of someone releasing something specific rather than collapsing under something general. Then she stopped and made coffee and went back to work. Because there was still work. There was always still work. The formal hearing before the full Senate Select Committee on Intelligence was scheduled for 6 weeks after the closed session. Mara testified in open session for 2 hours, in front of cameras, in front of a public gallery that included Devin Okafor's mother and sister in the 3rd row. She wore the civilian clothes she wore everywhere, dark slacks, a gray coat, the watch with the cracked crystal. She had been advised by 2 different people to consider wearing the uniform for the visual weight of it, for what it communicated. She had considered it and declined, because what she wanted communicated was not rank. It was something else. The something else was harder to pin down and easier to understand when she said, under oath and in front of cameras and in language she'd worked on carefully. I was a nurse at a community hospital who attended a military memorial because a young man I knew had died, and I believe something about his death was wrong. That's the beginning of this, not the uniform in the box. Not the service record, the belief that something was wrong, and the decision to say so. The chamber was quiet. The veterans in this program were not protected by their rank or their record or their service. They were targeted because they were paying attention. The protection we owe them is not ceremonial, it is structural. It is oversight with teeth, accountability with follow-through, and institutions that understand the difference between a database flag and a human life. She looked at the committee members. Devin Okafor understood that difference. He died for it. The least we can do is build something that makes sure the next person who finds a thread to pull doesn't have to bet their life on what's at the other end. The applause from the gallery was not supposed to happen in a Senate chamber. It happened anyway, brief and human and unstoppable, the way things sometimes are. Well, the trial of Leonard Farrow began 4 months later. It lasted 11 weeks. The prosecution presented 318 pieces of evidence, 16 witnesses, and the complete operational record of a program that had identified, flagged, and authorized action against 31 veterans across 6 states over 22 months, of whom 11 had been killed using the pharmaceutical protocol, and 4 more had been approached but survived the approach for various reasons. The most common of which was that someone had been home, or a neighbor had seen something, or the logistics had simply not aligned. Mara testified for 6 hours across 2 days. She was cross-examined for 3 of those hours by Farrow's defense team, who pursued the line about the intake assessments with considerable effort and considerable failure, because the distinction she'd articulated in the subcommittee session between what the clinical forms contained and what appeared in the Ariston database records was documented, verifiable, and not available to be argued away by good lawyers working hard. The jury deliberated for 4 days. On the 4th day, they returned. The courtroom had the specific quality of a space in which a large number of people are trying not to make any unnecessary sound. Farrow sat in a dark suit with the expression of a man who had spent 4 months being certain that the machinery would still save him, the habit of believing in his own protection being the last thing to go. The jury foreperson read the verdict on each count. Guilty, 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 guilty. 11 counts of murder in the first degree, 1 for each veteran killed under the protocol. 4 counts of attempted murder. Conspiracy, racketeering, abuse of office, and obstruction of a federal investigation. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. When he read the sentence, Farrow's expression did not change because men like Farrow were sometimes capable of not changing their expression even as their whole world rearranged itself around them, but something in his posture shifted. A small collapse, barely visible, the weight of a thing finally landing. Raymond Voss received 37 years. Stuart Ellery, whose cooperation had been the most comprehensive of any party, received 18 years with the possibility of parole after 12, a sentence that Mara had complicated feelings about and had been told, correctly, was not her determination to make. Thomas Brower received 22 years. 7 additional Ariston operational personnel received sentences ranging from 8 to 25 years. Derek Callahan received 12 years on the Fort Keswick assault charge and the conspiracy counts, concurrent. He had cooperated, and the cooperation had been genuine and had materially assisted the prosecution. She had been asked whether she had a victim statement to submit regarding the Fort Keswick charge. She had submitted one. It was 4 sentences long and did not contain a single word about his sentence length, because what she wanted the record to reflect was not her preference for a number, but the simple documented fact of what had happened. An officer who believed the woman in front of him was powerless had raised a weapon to prove it, and she had not moved, and the weapon had come down. The record reflected it. She went back to Callaway Regional the Monday after Farrow's sentencing. Not to her old position. The hospital had restructured the Veteran Services intake program during the preceding months, in coordination with a federal oversight framework that the Senate committee had established in the wake of the hearings, and the charge nurse rotation had been reorganized. She went back as a clinical consultant to the new Veteran Services framework, a position she'd been offered 6 weeks earlier and had taken 2 weeks to accept. Petra Nguyen had kept the trauma bay running with a precision that Mara found both satisfying and mildly annoying. She told Petra this when she stopped by on the first morning. Petra looked at her with the expression of someone who had been watching national news for 4 months and was choosing not to make a speech about it. "You look tired," Petra said. "I am tired." "You need coffee." "I have coffee." "Better coffee." Petra took her cup and replaced it with one from her own thermos, and that was, in its way, the most complete welcome home Mara received from anyone. The new position was different from the intake assessments in every way that mattered. The Veteran Services Framework operated under a transparency protocol. No data pipeline to external contractors, all records management done internally through the hospital's IT department under quarterly federal audits. She helped design part of it. Not alone, and not perfectly, and there were 3 revisions in the first 2 months that required more meetings than she found useful. But the meetings produced something real at the end of them, which was the criterion she used. Victor Reyes attended the Thursday group the week after the trial concluded. He sat in the same chair he always sat in, slightly too far from the center because he liked to have room to stretch his knee, and he brought gas station coffee, enough for everyone. And when the group leader opened the session, he said he had something he wanted to say. "I know I was on a list," he said. "I know what that list meant." He looked around the room. "I have 3 kids. My oldest is 14, and she already knows more about what happened this fall than I've told her, because 14-year-olds find things out." He stopped. "She asked me if I was scared, and I told her. I was scared for about 20 minutes on my porch, and then I watched someone do the thing that needed doing, and the scared went somewhere smaller." He looked at Mara across the circle. "I don't know how to say thank you for that, so I just brought the coffee." She looked at him. "The coffee's fine," she said. There was a small sound around the room that was almost a laugh and was something more than that. There is a specific thing that happens when an institution decides that the people it was built to serve are a liability. It does not happen all at once. It happens in small decisions made by people who tell themselves that each individual decision is reasonable, that the structure they're serving is larger than any one person, that the numbers justify the logic. It happens in databases and memos, and chain of custody records and protocols named with words that have nothing to do with what they do. The people in those databases did not disappear quietly. Some of them found threads and pulled. Most of those people were not retired generals. Most of them were not nurses with 20 years of military intelligence experience and relationships that could move a Senate subcommittee in 48 hours. Most of them were just people paying attention, young, trying to rebuild something, operating on the assumption that the system they'd served would not turn its machinery toward them. That assumption was wrong, and it cost 11 of them everything. And it is the wrong that no sentence and no Senate hearing and no framework can fully address, because the dead do not receive frameworks. They receive memorials, and their families receive explanations, and the rest of us receive the knowledge of what happened and the choice of what to do with it. Devin Okafor made his choice with a database report and a link sent to 4 phone numbers and a voicemail left by a 61-year-old records technician who could not sleep after doing something he knew was wrong. That chain of choices, made by people who had no way of knowing they were making a chain, is what unraveled it. Not one person, not one act. A series of human beings who decided that a thing being wrong was sufficient reason to say so, even without knowing whether it would matter. Mara Voss, Mara Whitmore, had put a uniform in a box because she was tired, and that was honest, and the tiredness had been real. She had built something small and useful and uncomplicated, and she had believed it was enough. She does not think she was wrong to believe that, because the life she'd built had made her the person who could walk into that courtyard at Fort Keswick and not move when a weapon came up, the person who could read a folder in a kitchen at 2 in the morning and know exactly which calls to make, the person who had sat across from 43 veterans on Tuesday afternoons and learned their names and their situations with a care that became, in the end, the most specific form of evidence against the thing that had tried to use that care against her. You do not always know, while you are building a thing, what it is being built for. She knows that now. She knew it before, in a different context, but she knows it again in a way that is less like knowledge and more like the thing underneath knowledge. The settled understanding that what you do in the quiet years is not separate from who you are when the quiet ends. That the steady and the quiet and the unglamorous accumulation of days in which you simply show up and do the work is not a lesser version of being useful. It is sometimes the whole preparation. The box is still in her closet. The uniform is still in it. She has not taken it out and she may not. But she has stopped calling it finished.